Good morning. Good morning, everybody. That's a lovely cup, Jenna. Thank you. So it's Thursday, October 17th. Let's welcome everybody to the Little Hoover Commission hearing on the Public-Philanthropic Partnerships. My name is Pedro Nava. I'm the chair of the Little Hoover Commission. Again, thanks for joining us today. I want to introduce the other commissioners who are here. Some are with us already. Others will be joining us shortly. We have Vice Chair Anthony Cannella, Commissioners Dion Aroner. We will be joined by Commissioner David Byer. Gil Garcetti is already signed on. Jose Atilio Hernandez will be joining us, and Jana Sidley is here. The legislative members of our commission may join us later, that being Assembly Member Philip Chen, Senator David Min, Assembly Member Liz Ortega, and Senator Scott Wilk. Also with us today are the commission staff, Executive Director Ethan Rarick, Analyst Ashley Hurley, Allie Powell, and Shara McAllister, along with project managers Crystal Beckham and Daniel Harris McCoy. I've got to do a little bit of housekeeping before we turn to the subject at hand. We're live streaming today's hearing on Zoom, and we're being joined by members of the public who are attending remotely. We'll have a public comment session at the end of the hearing. Members of the public who have joined us online will be muted during the hearing. Those who wish to make a comment will be unmuted during the public comment session at the end. If you'd like to make a public comment online, please use the raise hand feature in Zoom by clicking on the hand icon to join our public comment queue. Those who have joined us by phone may send us an email indicating you'd like to address the commission. You must provide the phone number from which you have joined the meeting so that our staff knows who to unmute. Staff will be monitoring raised hands and emails requesting comment during the duration of the hearing. If you are at our publicly noticed in-person location and you want to make a public comment, please fill out a public comment slip and give it to one of our staff members. As is usual at commission hearings, public comment is limited to 3 minutes per speaker. We are recording today's hearing, and after the hearing, staff will place a permanent link to the recording on our website and upload it to our YouTube channel. And now to the substance of today's hearing. This is the first in a series of commission hearings examining the state's relationship with nonprofit organizations. These hearings will result in 2 sets of recommendations. One that relates to state partnership with foundations, and the other relating to the state's relationship with public charities that receive state taxpayer dollars. Today's hearing will focus on public philanthropic partnerships, but will also introduce key issues in state contracting with nonprofits. The Newsom administration has worked to increase public philanthropic partnerships in California. These partnerships have been key in helping the state engage in planned events, such as the census outreach, and to respond to emergencies such as COVID. The commission is looking at what factors have led to successful public philanthropic relationships, how to institutionalize the infrastructure that leads to success, and where there might be opportunities for improvement. This hearing will expand on the work the commission did in its study on intimate partner violence. In 2020, we recommended that the state provide the nonprofits participating in the Domestic Violence Assistance Program with the entirety of their grant funding up front in order to prevent delays in funding that could affect service delivery. This recommendation was signed into law the following year. At the time, nonprofit representatives shared that other public charities suffered similar threats to service delivery from state contracting inefficiencies. We took to heart those concerns and now are looking at ways to make the state's relationship with the nonprofit sector more efficient. At today's hearing, we'll take testimony from those outside state government. At a second hearing on these issues next month, we hope to take input from Newsom administration officials. We have 2 different subcommittees working on various components of this broader study, and I want to thank Commissioners Sidley, Hernandez, Aroner, and Garcetti for their leadership on this crucial topic. Now I'd like to ask Project Manager Crystal Beckham to introduce the first witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Our first witness is Jim Ferris, who is the director for the Center on Philanthropy and Public Policy. He is the Emery Evans Olson Chair in Nonprofit Entrepreneurship and Public Policy, and he's a professor at the Sol Price School of Public Policy, all at the University of Southern California. Welcome, Mr. Ferris. When you're ready, please unmute yourself and start your video and begin your testimony.
Hello, can y'all hear me?
We can.
Yes.
Thanks for inviting me, and I'm happy to share some perspectives on public-private partnerships that have emanated from a set of research over the last decade. I'll start with a definition of public-private partnerships, which is pretty generic. Public-private partnerships provide a vehicle or a strategy for achieving greater impact than if government or the private sector worked alone rather than together. And when I talk about private sector, I'm including both philanthropy and business, although much of the work I talk about is around philanthropic public-private partnerships. It goes without saying that neither sector, public or philanthropic, is monolithic. On the government side, we have local governments, we have state governments, and we have national governments. And while the focus of this hearing is on state government, we know that there are these partnerships that happen at all levels of government, although they vary in different interesting ways. Likewise, philanthropy is not monolithic either. It's very pluralistic. You have a large number of individual donors of substance with some substantial means, and you have a lot of foundations. There's an opportunity in philanthropy historically to act alone rather than together. And over the last generation, last 20 years or so, we find more collaboration within philanthropy. And over the last, say, 10 or 15 years, there's been an increased interest in working with government directly in partnership. And we'll talk a little bit about that, why that is momentarily. Let me start with the premise, the value proposition for why partner. What you get when you bring the sectors together to work jointly is a nimbleness and a flexibility that government and philanthropy don't always have. And second element is a leveraging of knowledge, resources, and relationships and networks to get things done. And a lot of what philanthropy brings to the table is knowledge about the communities they serve, and that where you have shared interests between philanthropy and the public sector. And then thirdly is a credibility and a reputation that you get with both sectors working together, especially if one of the sectors has less support institutionally among the public. So there are a lot of advantages for bringing the sectors together to work jointly, and that's an important beginning step, but that's only a beginning step. There are challenges for the sectors working together, and the best way to think of it is that government has a set of institutional logics and constraints that inhibit or limit what they can do, and philanthropy has its own set of ways of working, of practice, institutional logic, and they don't always mesh across the sectors. So there's a challenge in getting the sectors to work together. In many cases, we find that the sectors, government looks at philanthropy as a mystery, and the same thing happens on the philanthropic side when they look at government. And so in order to get these partnerships to work, we have to demystify the sectors to each other. and try to generate a level of trust and understanding that allow them to work together. That's sometimes easier said than actually done. And so if you think about the partnerships, and you mentioned it at the beginning, it's easy to get the sectors to work together when they face crises, whether it's COVID or a hurricane or an earthquake. Whenever there are these moments of crisis, whether man-made or natural, it's easy to pull the forces across the sectors together. What's more challenging is when you try to get the sectors to work together on an ongoing basis. That's where you're less likely to see people relaxing the various constraints or changing their practices. And COVID's a great example of this, because people were willing to do things they wouldn't do otherwise together. So that's an important piece. But the challenge is, if we think of public-private partnerships as a new way of governing for the common interest, then we need to figure out a way to get the sectors to understand each other and work together. And one of the possibilities for that is to create an infrastructure for partnerships, which are sometimes, they're referred in different ways, but offices of strategic partnerships is a common term used to describe that.
Yeah, Mr. Ferris. Mr.
Yep.
Ferris, hi. This is Pedro Nava. Sorry to interrupt you. What I neglected to tell you, and I try to do this at the beginning of the meetings, I don't always do it, is that it is not uncommon for commissioners, when they hear comments and part of your remarks, that they'll raise their hands because they want to ask you a question.
Okay.
And I'd appreciate it if you took these interruptions as compliments, because what they're really trying to tell you is that you've sparked some interest and they want to ask you questions in the moment. And so I already have Commissioner Sidley, who has raised her hand, along with Commissioner Byer. So if you'll excuse us.
Oh, sure.
Oh, great. Thank you. Commissioner Sidley, if you would.
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Ferris, for your testimony today. I appreciate it. I just want to build on something that I think you're talking about. And that is, when you're talking partially about the constraints of government, if there is a commingling of government funds with philanthropic funds or any other funds, you are immediately required then to live by government code, lowest responsible bidder, prevailing wage, things of that nature, which obviously the government feels is very, very important. And I'm just wondering if those are the constraints that you're referring to. And when you talk about how it's easier in a crisis, those constraints are sometimes waived due to the fact that you have to then do a bid quickly. You don't have to go out for a request, an RFP, things of that nature. And therefore it's easier to partner. And so you've sort of been alluding to that, but I think I'm digging down a little deeper to just draw it out and see if that's actually what you're speaking of.
That's one case. It's not the only one. I think it raises this point that I should have underscored earlier, is that these partnerships are not just about funding. And there are different ways of funding that get around some of the constraints. You could have coordinated funding, not pooled funding. And so you can get into sort of the nitty-gritty of how you structure them. But part of it is getting people from the two sectors together to actually talk about the problem and solutions. And there can be a lot of information sharing. And so there's a spectrum of partnerships, from just sharing information all the way to sort of the gold standard, I guess, where you actually have co-design of public programs. And so there's a lot of complexity beneath the generalities of partnerships.
Understood. I think it'd be very helpful to understand your spectrum, because one of the things I think we'd like to come out with is some guidelines for different philanthropic groups, government groups that want to work together. And so I think that spectrum of certainly sharing information, you're right, doesn't involve money. And so we don't trigger these other things that I've mentioned. I think all that is very, very helpful for, you know, I'm a government lawyer. I was the general counsel at the Port of Los Angeles, and often people wanted to partner with the port, and various ways of doing that. So one of the things that I'd be very interested in making sure our report just sort of delineates is the various ways that we can work together. I like the idea that I'm hearing you of sort of two pillars of money, but not commingling the money, things like that. So that would be ultimately very helpful, I think, for our overall report to understand the spectrum that they're speaking of, because that will help as a guideline for, you know, once we do get these groups to talk to each other, to understand their various options and how to improve those partnerships. So thank you. I appreciate that. David, I see your hand is up, sir.
You're muted, David.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, thank you to the witness for the testimony. Really, really well done. I want to ask two different threads of questions. One is about structure and the second is about scale. So first on the structure, you note, and the material you supplied goes into this, but I think it would be really helpful to differentiate for the commissioners the 501c3, 5% donations per year kind of legal structure for the traditional foundations, and then to differentiate that from other public charities, and then thirdly, from other philanthropic efforts. The one that I'm the most familiar with is corporate foundations. In my career, I ran the foundation for Xerox and one for Amgen. And then the last is the relatively recent structural changes in social venture capital, of which we saw an example as a commission in the California Resilience Rebuilding Fund, which was administered by Kiva, but operated through a series of community development financial institutions. So if you could just take a minute and describe the structural differences, because we're probably stronger on the government side and knowing about pay after activity, those kinds of problems, but we're less familiar with the legal strictures and rules on the philanthropy side. And then I have a set of questions about a scale.
Yeah, so let me take a stab at that. So I'm thinking of when we're talking about philanthropy or public-private partnerships, I'm thinking about foundations.
And not the others, right?
Well, the private foundations, but it also could include contributions from donors. So that you can have mega donors that have donor advised funds that can make contributions. But typically what happens when you think about philanthropy, you're thinking of it as one monolithic entity. And part of what has happened is when you say in COVID, for example, you get the foundations and donors can come together and pool their resources on the philanthropic side. And so there's more complexity when you talk about philanthropy. And that could also include the corporate contributions. So if you look at Rebuilding Detroit, which is a case that I know a little bit about, you had JP Morgan, you had a lot of financial institutions, you had foundations, you had individual donors that came together to sort of partner with the city. And so there are a lot of possibilities, and part of it becomes very particular to the partnership you're trying to create.
Okay. Right. I guess the reason for raising this, and obviously we can cover it in subsequent hearings, but many high net worth individuals and families have now gone to a structure with limited liability corporations where you can make investments and make money, as well as philanthropic through donor advised funds and other structures. Those are emerging, particularly in California. And the largest philanthropic effort in California is Silicon Valley Community Fund. So we've got to, I think, help our fellow commissioners get away from the idea it's the Ford Foundation model, which is from 50 years ago.
Exactly. But even the so you're talking about Silicon Valley where you have a lot of individual donors, but it's a community foundation.
Right.
But Silicon Valley will partner with other community foundations on different objectives or partnerships or projects. And so that just underscores what I was trying to say about how philanthropy is not monolithic. But they also, we find over the last generation, especially the last 15 years or so, that those forces inside of philanthropy are working together.
Right.
Regardless of their structure or form. So it's not uncommon for the Ford Foundation to work with the Chan Zuckerberg.
Right.
So it makes it more complicated for government or people outside of philanthropy to understand who their partner is and what drives them.
Right. The second species of questions is really around scale, because I read through the material for the hearing, and there are some really good examples of things at a very small scale, emergency response, things where community knowledge is vital. And I'm sure our subsequent witnesses are going to deal with this, but it would be helpful to know examples of things that are at a scale of more than $1 billion. Now, using that as kind of arbitrary cutoff, where the effort is big enough so that the state or the locality, in a case of a county or city, can devote people to learning about the philanthropy and how to partner and govern that project, as opposed to something that's 5 million, 10 million, or even 40 million, where it's an additional job for somebody who's already in government employment, because there's less incentive for those small scale projects for those government people to learn about philanthropy. So how do we distinguish based on size?
Yeah, so I don't have a good answer to the size question. I would just say that sometimes you start small and it gets bigger. It doesn't always, it's hard to start a partnership at a high level. And if you're working in regions or localities, it's not going to be at the same dollar amount as if you're doing statewide. Some of the most interesting partnerships happen at the State Department, and they tend to be partnerships between the federal government and corporations working in third world countries. So you have to look at the situation, the problem in the context of the place and what you're trying to do. So to just look at scale separately from that is very difficult, I think.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, you can continue, Mr. Ferris.
So those are great questions, and it gets to the next point I was going to make. And this is this idea that if you're going to think of public-private partnerships as an innovation in the way we govern for the common good, then how do we create an infrastructure for partnerships? And this is sort of an experiment that's been happening across the levels of government. And it's trying to find people that can bring the sectors together. And this increase, this uptick in public-private partnerships is in part because there's a need and a realization you can do more together than alone. But also because we now have a set of individuals who have moved between the sectors. So people in philanthropy that came out of government or vice versa, the sectors are not mysterious to them. And we now have a cadre of folks that we would call triathletes, people that can work in different across sectors, that have been in them, have a deep understanding, and can see the opportunities for how the sectors can work together. And so we have the human capital to do these partnerships because of that. We also have efforts to create infrastructure within government which are these offices of strategic partnership or director of social innovation at the local or state or federal level, where we actually are trying to institutionalize it into the structure for public problem solving. And so there are a growing number of these offices, which give the possibility that this can be an ongoing resource for government and philanthropy or the private sector to work together. They're sort of fragile still, because what our experience is, unless there's strong backing from the executive, then they sort of come and go sometimes with changes in administration. And so there are some that have lasted for a long time. Say, the state of Michigan has an Office of Foundation Liaison that's like just celebrated its 20th anniversary. And it's been able to withstand changes from Democratic to Republican governors and back. There are other cases sometimes at the local level where you get a new mayor and the mayor decides they don't want to have an office of strategic partnership, or they want a different model. And so it's sort of, you know, we're still at a point where trying to institutionalize these offices to create an infrastructure partnership is still a challenge. And we know it, and we've seen it at all levels. When you have a change in administrations, then sometimes they survive and sometimes they wither.
Good.
Dion?
Oh, yes, I see. Yeah, you're right. Oh, look at Mr. Ferris. I'll hand you the job. No, go take it.
Thank you. Mr. Ferris, one of the questions I have, having worked in government for a real long time, is whether or not government, and in this case, let's talk about state government, whether or not state government is ready to partner when they aren't very good at their interagency relationships at all. In other words, they're siloed and they have a very hard time even talking to each other from one agency to the other. And so how does that play out in working with foundations, right? In that what you were just kind of talking about, which is, you know, is addressing a large problem in a community, which requires not just one foundation, but very often many, which have different focuses, right? I mean, the idea is, you know, someone has a health foundation, somebody else has a different kind, that kind of thing. But the state government doesn't match it in that way in regards to interagency relationships.
Yeah, I mean, that's a challenge, but so to the extent people think about solving problems within a systems framework that go across silos, sometimes you find that there's more cooperation both on the philanthropy side with each other and also within government. So there are examples of some of these offices where they have brought the different agencies in a government together, say, to focus on kids, family and kids. And then you sort of can pull together the philanthropic entities that have common interests. And so it becomes a broader, more complicated table, but it allows to sort of overcome some of the silos that you talk about.
Yeah, Vice Chair Cannella.
Thank you, sir. You know, I was formulating my question when Dion was asking her, so I hope it's not the same question. So I know we're talking about the philanthropic space, but I'm in the construction world, and we talk about P3s. When it comes to construction, there's tension between state government and, you know, the private side. You know, in the past, the state government wanted to keep it all, and do you find that with what you do as well? Are the agencies sometimes trying to hold the work for themselves and maybe not as helpful to the private side that's coming up to team along with them?
Well, that's sort of what they've been taught or their experiences over time. And all of this partnership requires a change in behavior, right? And expectations. I was on the committee for the National Park Service, and I was talking about partnerships, and the attorneys just stared me down. Like, they were always trying to have separation between the philanthropic funding for the national parks and the national park budget. But that's the challenge if you're going to try and sort of suggest partnerships as a strategy for greater impact. You have to sort of change the mindset, the behaviors. And so there's a value proposition where there are benefits, but it's not without cost. And so you just have to sort of go in understanding that calculus and make a choice about whether it's worth the effort. And if the benefits are sufficiently great, you'll take it on. And then in some cases, you fall back. I mean, there are a lot of examples of where, the partnerships didn't work out. You tried and it went away. And then there are others where it succeeded. And a key part of that is leadership. Are there people driving the change? Whether it's from the government side or the philanthropic private sector side. And so it becomes very, based on different cases and who's the leader, where's the leadership.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Mr. Ferris. I mean, I think what you pointed out is what we often find as we take on study topics in different areas, and that is so much of success of an initiative has to do with the commitment of the leaders on whatever side, the various stakeholders. What is their motivation? What do they hope to obtain? And that old saying that there's no telling how much you can accomplish if you don't care who gets the credit is as valuable now as it always has been. So it's about setting the tone and about trying to ensure that the players all are motivated in order to reach that particular objective. Let me turn to other commissioners. If you have any further questions for Mr. Ferris, let me know. And if not, then we can thank you very much, sir, for taking the time for your contribution to our discussion.
Happy to do so.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, Ethan, or I'm sorry, Crystal.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our next witness is Kathleen Janus, who is a senior advisor at Freedman Consulting. She's also a lecturer at Stanford University, and she formerly was a senior advisor on social innovation to Governor Newsom. Welcome, Ms. Janus. When you're ready, please unmute yourself and start your video.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you so much for having me here today to talk about a topic that's very near and dear to my heart. I've spent my entire career focused on social innovation and how we can bring new solutions to solve intractable problems, from climate change to homelessness. There's no shortage of big problems that we need to solve in this world. And the good news is, in my experience, there are so many incredible leaders that are stepping up ready to solve them. But chipping away at these problems little by little is never going to achieve the kind of scale that we want. And while government programs may have that scale and be huge, they need that nimbleness of the private sector to innovate so that they can bring new models to scale. So we need both. And I truly believe that public-private partnerships are the way of the future, because I've seen that when you practice social innovation inside of government, the potential for impact is both immediate and exponential. So I went into government to turn that conviction into meaningful change. And in June of 2019, Governor Newsom appointed me as the first ever senior advisor on social innovation in the state of California to lead public-private partnerships. In the years that followed, working with Governor Newsom, I helped lead 50 public-private partnerships totaling $4.3 billion, impacting the lives of millions of Californians. Some examples of those partnerships include a $150 million fund for financial relief for undocumented immigrants during the pandemic, a partnership with the California Association of Food Banks and the Department of Agriculture to donate 125 million pounds of fresh produce to food banks, a $38 million partnership with the Public Health Institute and the Department of Public Health to help distribute COVID vaccines to our most vulnerable Californians. But for me, it's not just about the impact of the partnerships themselves, it's how we did the work. And through my time in government, we helped 25 departments and agencies across the state work with 202 corporate and philanthropic partners in over 1,000 community-based organizations. So while in most states, public and private sectors work in silos, oblivious often, as Mr. Ferris described, to how the work gets done on the other side, which is often a mystery. In California, we've really helped build a gold standard. We've built this muscle for public-private partnerships that will serve as a model for other states and I believe exponentially change the lives of millions of people for years to come. So I won't go too deeply into definitions. Mr. Ferris already covered that, but I will say that as you have identified, this spectrum of public-private partnerships is really important and can be anything from more autonomous forms of information sharing all the way to co-investing and everything in between. I've written in the Stanford Social Innovation Review about several ingredients that I think have been critical to our success in California in developing public-private partnerships. And I will submit that article as testimony, but briefly I'll identify a few of them for you here. One is the relationship building, and that was a big part of my role as senior advisor to Governor Newsom. Second, that partnerships require the buy-in and leadership from both the public and private sector. To your point, Commissioner, you can't just have one partner taking the lead. It has to be a team effort. Third, true partnerships are about addressing real problems with real resources. Fourth, successful partnerships require communicating the impact. And finally, to build partnerships, you need infrastructure and support. And that included my role as senior advisor, where I played a really critical role as a translator to help government agencies understand how philanthropic partners work, and then also to help philanthropic partners understand how state agencies work. That sort of infrastructure and support was also at the private level with literally hundreds of private partners. So I'm proud to say that California's public-private partnership work has only grown since I left my position as senior advisor to Governor Newsom in June of 2022. I was succeeded by Elena Chavez-Quesada, who has continued to build public-private partnerships over the past 2.5 years. Another way that Governor Newsom has helped institutionalize this work is by asking state agencies themselves to appoint public-private partnership liaisons in many of our state agencies. And so what that means is that those state agencies are now leading partnerships themselves and building the infrastructure at the agency level to lead public-private partnerships. We're also seeking to grow this work in other states. As you mentioned, I'm a senior advisor at Freedman Consulting, where I am building a coalition that we're calling the State Partnerships Lab to try and develop tools and resources to help other states develop public-private partnership initiatives. My dream would be that all 50 states have governors with public-private partnership liaisons or strategic partnership offices. I'll identify briefly several challenges to public-private partnerships. One, as you mentioned, as Mr. Ferris also mentioned, is creating this sense of urgency. The COVID-19 pandemic catalyzed urgency and innovation like never before. How do you create that sense of urgency around everyday crises like climate change and homelessness? Second, are conflicts of interest. There are many ways that real and perceived conflicts of interest are obstacles to partnership. It's really important to be aware of those and to avoid them. Third is lack of capacity, and that could be internal in government or external in private partners. These partnerships do take a lot of work, and having a dedicated person who is in charge of leading those efforts is really important. Another barrier to partnerships is a lack of motivation internally and externally to actually do the partnerships. Everybody has to be on board if you want these partnerships to happen. And finally, our ongoing political factors. Even when politicians do set up the infrastructure to advance partnership within their administration, these liaison offices can be dismantled when a new administration comes into power. So I am very encouraged that the partnerships that we started in the Newsom administration have continued not only to thrive, but to improve the lives of millions of Californians. And more important, now that a few years have passed since we launched these partnerships, I can see the impact is so much greater than the partnerships themselves, that systems and communities are changing. And that innovation at scale is really the ultimate promise of public-private partnership. And I see Commissioner Garcetti has his hand raised.
Yeah, he does. There's a couple. And I just want to say, you strike me, Mr. Ferris referred to those folks that, have one foot in both worlds.
Yes.
It seems that you are an example of that. And along with your experience, one of the things that Commissioner Sidley brought up was, when the state is involved in the state's rules tend to apply as it relates to the money. And Mr. Ferris talked about how when he, at a meeting when the lawyers on the other side were just staring him down. And I think that your background as an attorney allows you to function as a translator of sorts, because sometimes the legal issues become insurmountable because people make them insurmountable. Let me turn to Commissioner Garcetti and followed by Commissioner Beyer.
Thank you. Your written testimony that you provided, as well as Mr. Ferris, was exceptional. Really very, very impressive. And thank you for taking the time and the effort to put in that kind of quality work. You didn't give us an outline, you gave us information. So thank you with that. I'm not sure that while you worked for the state, you slept much. It doesn't seem possible with all the work that you had that you slept much. But the very last topic you brought up is the topic that I'm most concerned about. And that is change in administrations. How do you keep something going? I don't know if you can generalize or help us in any way, because this is my first experience in this. But do you see that if there's a partnership that is established, that it's usually going to be 2-3 years, or could it be decades long? And the longer there is a partnership, the more risks there are that after some real top focus, you and others, for example, that focus diminishes and it's not as effective, perhaps, as it would be. Can you add anything more to this?
Yes. Well, thank you so much for your kind words. And I am now, I've never heard the term triathlete to use to describe my role, so I will add that title to my resume. But I don't think you necessarily even have to be a triathlete in order to really understand and internalize the power of public-private partnerships. And to answer your question about creating the continuity and the longevity of these partnerships, as I mentioned, I think what I feel most proud of is that every time we would have a state agency partner involved in one of these partnerships, it did require a lot of handholding at first off, and that translator role is really important. But I think anyone at the state level who has been involved in a successful public-private partnerships then gets it. And not only gets it, but understands, the tools and the strategies that are required in order to partner with the private sector, and vice versa. We've created an atmosphere for partnership where we've eliminated barriers, both in terms of demystifying what the other sector is doing, but also creating the infrastructure for communication and building those relationships. We established in 2020 the governor's first State of California Philanthropy Summit, which was a good opportunity for state leaders to start to have direct conversations with philanthropic partners. And that summit has continued every year since. And so those are examples of ways to create continuity. And I cannot stress enough the importance of infrastructure and having the liaisons in state government and in the private sector, but the state government is what the state can control to ensure that these partnerships last beyond just
I don't mean to cut you off, but Governor Newsom obviously made a very wise choice with you, and I'm confident he made a good choice with your replacement. And this question that I'm going to ask you right now may be too personal, but why did you leave?
Well, I think that we all didn't sleep a lot during COVID. I think you're right. And to me, I really gave it my all over 3 years. And I think in some sense, the biggest testimony to my success is the fact that the work has lasted beyond me. And that was always my intention. And I'm excited to be sharing that work with other states now as well. I'm working, for example, with Governor Moore in Maryland to help him build his public-private partnerships initiative. And in the meantime, I think my family is happy that they get to see me a little.
Great. Thank you very much.
3 young children.
Commissioner Byer, please.
Well, I'd like to add another accolade in addition to the triathlete one. You could conceivably describe your role for Governor Newsom as a liaison or as an ambassador, but I think you carried around a Swiss Army knife to stitch together the partnerships that you talked about. And so it was not just convener, but you were the implementer of very good ideas. And I want to focus on two particular kinds of things where I think public-private partnerships can be useful. One is flexibility. An example would be the use of economic prizes, that is to put up money to secure an innovative idea. While the federal government has authority, all the agencies do, to use prizes, they don't use them very often. And the state of California has authority to do it for, I think it's $50,000. But philanthropy can come up with a prize contest to stimulate really bold new thinking. And the second example is the strictures of civil service in terms of hiring and procuring talent. We all know as a commission, the civil service system in California is largely broken. The number of job categories is mind-boggling. But in the private sector and philanthropy, it's possible to hire people without a lot of those strictures. So if you could comment on that economic prize theory or similar economic incentives that philanthropy can use, or the flexibility. And last point, please say hi to Tom Freedman, the head of Freedman Consulting. You guys have been doing great work on this subject for decades.
That's right. I will. So I agree that innovation is in every community around the state if you just look for it. And one of the most rewarding experiences of my time in state government was the listening tour that I did from border to border, visiting tribes in Del Norte County all the way down to the Tijuana border in San Diego, and seeing just how communities really know how to solve their problems if you give them the resources to do that. And I think that's one of the ways in which sometimes we can all be in our silos in Sacramento and, be doing our work and not have the opportunity to go out into community as much. But what public-private partnerships allow for is to tap into those ideas and whether it's through partnerships you know, working and connecting with state agencies to expand that innovation, or whether it's through prizes. There are some great examples of that. Obama's Office of Social Innovation had a similar prize structure that we could certainly learn from. I think it's critical that the state bring an all hands on deck approach to solving our problems and finding the most innovative ideas. On the personnel side, I think there are some excellent examples of where the private sector can help fund positions that maybe state government cannot, to create more nimbleness and flexibility. And then also, you know, I'm all about bringing in more triathletes and creating more exchanges with the with government from the private sector and vice versa. And there's some great models of that, whether that's the Partnership for Public Service, which is working at the federal level, or for example, Fuse Corps, which is looking at the local level, and bringing fellows from the private sector into local government. We should do something like that at the state level as well.
So just to be clear, there are a couple examples from the federal side. One would be United States Digital Service, which arose in the Obama administration to implement the ACA and is still in place, where you bring people in for 2 years into government outside the confines of the civil service hiring program and have them assigned to a specific task to help government get up to speed on data, or Code for America, which is a California entity. So the examples I think you're pointing to suggest a very rich set of possibilities across various government services.
Agreed.
Yeah, this is Pedro. One of the things that struck me about your experience in terms of being an attorney and being a translator and being able to communicate effectively with stakeholders. I had an example. I had a piece of legislation that had to do with California gardens, right? Gardens for schools and gardens for campuses. And I had opposition from the Farm Bureau. And so I asked, and this is again touches upon, I think, what you said, you have to bring people together and let them talk. So I brought the Farm Bureau reps in, and we talked about my bill, and there was a phrase, it was a term of art that meant nothing to me, but that meant everything to the Farm Bureau, because there were consequences to that specific phrasing. So we changed the phrasing, which didn't change the outcome or the goal, and then the Farm Bureau lifted their opposition because it no longer was a sort of a trigger for their constituents. Have you had examples of that in your experience with talking, with agencies as in communication with philanthropic organizations to sort of bridge that gap?
Well, I think that was my entire role, was really bridging that gap and helping agencies to understand where philanthropy could be helpful. The state budget is hundreds of billions of dollars. And so it would be very easy to say, well, what do we need this small amount of philanthropic capital for? This would be a drop in the bucket. And so helping to understand, well, where are the opportunities for that nimble, flexible philanthropic risk capital to help be more innovative? And so I think, again, that goes back to the point of infrastructure, is who are those translators who can help to understand where are the trigger points going to be and where are the opportunity points going to be able to work toward partnership.
All right. Thank you. Turning to fellow commissioners, any questions for Ms. Janus? If not, do you have anything else you'd like to add at this point?
No, just thank you so much for covering this. And my hope is that by lifting up this work more, that we can institutionalize it more within the state and have even more impact, because the problems that we face in this world are too big to wait.
Thank you very much. Crystal, we have another witness.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our next witness is Geoff Green, who is the Chief Executive Officer for the California Association of Nonprofits. Welcome, Mr. Green. When you're ready, please unmute yourself and begin your video.
Yeah, where's Geoff? Geoff, before you start,
yes,
maybe you can explain to us why it is that the Assembly Committee on Nonprofits is chaired by a Santa Barbara resident. The Senate Committee on Nonprofits is chaired by a Santa Barbara resident. And you, Mr. Green, representing statewide nonprofits, are a Santa Barbara resident. What happened?
it's a really good question. It just seems that all good things emanate from the Central Coast these days. I don't know what else to say.
What a diplomat. Thank you. Good to have you.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you, commissioners, for the invitation to speak with you today. So as stated, my name is Geoff Green. I serve as CEO of the California Association of Nonprofits. We're a 40-year-old institution that is essentially a policy alliance of more than 10,000 members and partners across the state of California, representing the nonprofit public charitable sector. And we're really here to do a few things. One is, of course, to advance policies that support the sector. We also provide education to the leadership throughout the state, and when possible and periodically do our own research and data to sort of map the sector and offer tools to our members and others. The idea here, and what I'm going to speak of primarily, is around some of our most recent efforts around contracting and the partnerships between government and the nonprofit sector. But I thought I would start with just a brief overview of sort of the landscape and what the nonprofit charitable sector really looks like, because it's often misunderstood, certainly through no fault of anyone in particular. But it is massive. There is great public confidence in it, as some of you may know. Poll after poll says that people generally trust their nonprofit partners and nonprofit organizations in their communities. And the thing that's probably less well known is the economic power of the sector. So the last time, and this is a few years old now, that we actually mapped that, we were able to pinpoint that we were, in fact, the 4th largest employer if you take the entire sector together in the state of California. So in addition to being just really good people trying to solve problems and serve community, there is a real economic power and force within the nonprofit sector. So in an effort to bring those realities to bear on policy, and in particular the relationship between government and the sector, I'll offer a few other details. As of recently, the Attorney General's office says there are 107,000 nonprofits in the state of California. Now, most of those are very small. And in fact, 2/3 of the nonprofit sector are actually unstaffed, all volunteer organizations. So that tells you right there a bit about the capacity. And then that spans, logarithmic curve really all the way up to some of the largest health, education, international aid institutions we have are also 501c3 public charities. If you want to sort of a data point to get a sense of what that means, less than 0.5% of all nonprofits actually bring in 50% of all nonprofit revenue. So it gives you a sense of the scale and the scope of what that looks like. And that's partly why I think it's difficult for many organizations, nonprofits, as well as government partners and others, to conceive of the sector, as a whole sector in a cohesive sense, because of the incredible diversity, not only of size, scale, capacity, but also if you think of the missions of nonprofits and what they're here to do, it is quite literally anything under the sun. So from where we sit, nonprofits and sort of as they exist in our community are often one of the best ways to understand a community. If you want to know what the real priorities or needs, crisis responses, challenges are in a community, I would posit that taking a look at the nonprofits that have been built in that community will give you probably the best answer you might find. What are people concerned about? What are they working on? What do they dedicate their free time and capital to? And what are they passionate about? And that'll give you a sense of really what is important in any spot in our state, I would say. And we have often acted as complements to government and public work. And that has been true for decades. It has certainly become more so in the past several decades. And often that is because nonprofits can do things in ways that the government cannot directly do, for whatever reason. It may be structural, it may be cultural, it may be funding related. But we've often been an extension of the reach of government. So when there's a particular task that needs to be done and the public function and the public priorities of government need to go a little bit further, it's often a great strategy to connect with a nonprofit. One of the more challenging and I would say worse tendencies in this space is this notion that we're a cheap alternative. And that has been pushed in many ways, mostly unintentionally. And I have to say that nonprofits themselves are sometimes complicit in this. But it is not, in fact, a good notion to think of the nonprofit sector as simply a cheap way to get something done. And the only way that has happened in the past is underinvestment in the sector. So when you think about things like Charity Navigator and others that tended to measure the effectiveness or efficiency of a nonprofit based on how little they actually spent on their people, their infrastructure, that is what we would generally call a bad habit. So we're doing all we can to undo that and bring some equity into the system. The other challenge often in government partnerships is that nonprofits, because of their size and scale, oftentimes, and not always, but certainly for the medium and smaller size organizations, it's really an asymmetric relationship. So the power and scope of the public entity is much greater generally, and many times greater than the nonprofit that is the other partner. So it makes it difficult to make changes or to speak up to try to get something done better when in fact you've got a very small capacity organization working as a contractor with a large public entity. One of the other data points, if you look at all public expenditure across the country in recent years, and then you look at all philanthropic, nonprofit, charitable expenditure, it's roughly a 20-to-1 ratio. So it really is much smaller. And that's part of the reason that we do partner with government, because we know that if we're simply doing things to fix errors, to clean things up, we'll never catch up that way. So partnership with government itself is often the best way to get there. There's some cultural gaps, and some of my colleagues who've already spoken to you this morning have talked about that, structural and cultural, I would say. Flexibility is really built into the nonprofit sector. It tends to be a nimble by design organization, and oftentimes government has a whole different set of restrictions of how it must operate, and those two things often do mismatch. So part of what we're trying to do with our work is how do you bring those either closer into alignment or make room for each to operate in the way it needs to. So in contracting specifically, which is I know what I'm being asked to speak to you a bit this morning on, I would say there's a few big issues, and it's really, these are the barriers that we've been addressing. One is just overburdensome process. So the request, whether it's at the front end on an application, the amount of material, of data, of narrative that is asked of a nonprofit entity, oftentimes just an applicant and not even necessarily an already decided upon partner. And on the back end, reporting, certainly. And that reporting we know is critical. We're absolutely supporters of transparency, and we try to push that both inside and outside the sector. But sometimes it becomes redundant, meaning one agency will ask for something and another will ask for the same and another will ask for the same. And so we're trying to find ways to not make that so burdensome. And then directly in the flow of dollars, that's the other big challenge. So advance payment, which I'll talk a little bit more about in here in a moment, is a big one for us. And I know that's what's on your agenda, and I appreciate the materials that your staff put together for you. That would go a very long way to open the doors to more efficient partnerships. Reimbursement only is generally not a good model. There certainly are times where reimbursement may be necessary, but the default, we would argue, should always be advance pay. And then when reimbursement is necessary, prompt reimbursement. And that's the other challenge we have, is just a time lag. The reason that is such an issue for us oftentimes in the nonprofit sector is because of that smaller capacity. So many of these organizations that are critical partners to government do not have capital sitting and ready to cover cash flow changes. So that's the problem. We have had issues where debt has been taken out by nonprofits, and we get many of these stories, sometimes 6- and 7-figure debt, simply to do work that has already been contracted for with a government partner. But because those dollars aren't forthcoming and the expectation is that the nonprofit will execute on that agreement immediately, then that becomes a big problem. And of course, that debt has interest. That interest is not reimbursable. So you're actually, in a sense, subsidizing government. The nonprofit itself is for those contracts. So we're trying to fix those, among others. The other big one is the question of full cost. And this comes back to some of those, so what I would say, just error norms that were created in the sector a while back, which is this notion that it should be done cheaper. The real cost of the work, this whole notion of restricted funding, has become a problem. The good news in recent years, and you'll see some models of this in philanthropy, the latest terminology there is trust-based philanthropy. Not a new idea, but it's sort of a new branding of that notion, which is that you actually pay the full cost of the work and you allow flexibility. You trust that partner knows how to get the work done. And of course, you ask for reporting on the back end, but you want to make sure that you give that flexibility. So the cost of these challenges, the real cost within the nonprofit sector is at the front end, it's really non-participation. And what we do see, and may not always be observed on the government public entity side, but there are many nonprofits that may well be the very best partner for a government agency with a contract or a grant who simply can't afford to participate. And they look at the application, they look at what's being offered, and they look at what's being asked, and they simply make the calculation that they just can't do it. Not because they don't want to, not because they don't have incredible skills and something to offer, but simply because that structure won't work for them given their fiscal capacity and or structure. The other, I mentioned, it's taking on debt and actually, in that sense, subsidizing the government partner. And really the costs of delay for both parties. Anytime you're spending more time and people power on anything, it's really a cost at the end of the day. And so anything we could do to minimize those, to keep the critical work there and the critical information flowing, but eliminate everything else is where we're headed. We do know what works. That's the good news. Advanced pay is actually not a new idea. It's been done on a sort of case-by-case basis for decades. Looking back, we could find things as early as the 1970s where a particular program was legislated and funding was provided. And by the way, advanced payment was expected. And in those cases where it's not, I think the bigger challenge that you've heard more about recently is really the on-time question when reimbursement is necessary. The other thing that we know works is flexibility. And this comes back to that trust and that respect for the partner, and just the notion that the nonprofit actually is doing what it says, knows what it's doing. You've contracted for a good reason. And they may see something on the ground that needs to be changed. And so if they feel hemmed in or otherwise restricted from doing that, they know that they can't always do their most effective work. So that can be a big barrier for them. One of the recommendations that came up recently in the joint hearing that we were partnered in with both the Assembly and Senate Select Committee on the Nonprofit Sector was this question of internal communication among agencies. So when a filing may be required, it should be required once, ideally. Could we not build a system whereby once something has been submitted, it could be shared internally, either among agencies, departments, that if you need a 990 form, which of course is a public document, doesn't necessarily have to be a submission or resubmission on behalf of the contractor themselves, or could that be shared internally? So there are a lot of forms and reports that are requested, but once they're there, they may well be better ways to share that information internally with the partners. The other reality for us is that the data on advanced pay, reimbursement models is pretty slim. We just don't know a lot. And that's where we're very hopeful that you, by stepping forward and suggesting that gathering some information in this area could be helpful, we would absolutely say, yes, please. That would be very helpful to have some sense of what is and isn't happening, because there isn't really a central clearinghouse for that kind of information. You've seen some of the few reports that we know of that we've been able to find, the one from CAL FIRE, the one that you mentioned earlier in your introductory remarks, Chair Nagle, which was around the domestic violence work. So we have some really good reported data on what has worked. Unfortunately, it's just the minority. And I do see a hand, so I can pause there.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Green. Commissioner Aroner.
Yes. The tension, or at least my understanding about what the tension is in regards to the relationship very often between government and philanthropy, or the nonprofit sector, however you want to speak about it, because particularly in talking about advanced pay, I live in the Bay Area. I take the San Francisco Chronicle front page for the last, I don't know how many days now, has been around a couple of very large nonprofits where it appears possibly that the city and county of San Francisco wasn't doing appropriate oversight. It's not clear to me, newspapers or newspaper articles, or, a view from whoever's writing that. But it is a question, and it always has been a question of the public, and the taxpayer public, right, plays a role in all of this, in that that base wants to know that its money is being spent appropriately. They question government expenditures all the time, right? For all kinds of things. And so when you talk about advanced pay, and you should know that I was involved in legislation dealt with the advanced pay issue many, many years ago, actually. And to be sure that we could at least give 25% advance pay so that agencies could get off the ground in whatever we were asking them to do. But what's your thoughts about this issue about the public's role in this and their lack of or confidence in the ability of government to deliver using the nonprofit sector?
Thank you, Commissioner. Yeah, I read those articles too, as you might imagine. They get they get sent to me every morning. I mean, at a high level, I'll say that, yeah, bad actors or folks that are taking advantage of the system, we are the first to say that we want that policed, and we don't want those folks representing it in any sector. And of course, this happens all the time in the for-profit contracting world. You know, one bad actor makes for a really big problem for everyone else. So I think there are ways, and again, this is a sort of the due diligence on the front end. And if there are questions, I think sometimes contractual relationships can become almost habitual, and I think that's also a bad habit. So just saying, we've always done it this way, let's just keep going, is not a recipe for success. I think once you have trust and faith and the data to back it up from a partner, there are plenty of ways to show that publicly. As you noted, a lot of these organizations and this work is being done on really tough, critical issues that don't generally make the front page until something goes wrong. And in fact, you may have noticed that there is now a campaign in San Francisco just launched, I think, 2 weeks ago, to sort of remind the public of, this is all the work that the nonprofit sector does that you never hear about.
Exactly.
And there's a reason that we generally trust our sector, because we know these folks. They tend to be us or someone we know. And so I think that is, I don't know that ever goes away as a problem, but I do think there are ways to ask for what we need without overburdening everyone just because of one bad actor. And then to be clear that makes it that is no longer appropriate. Like if that went sideways, we will, not be working in that way in the future. So that's not something we would ever push back against.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that government is pure in this either, right? I legislated around school districts, right, that gone belly up, right, and had to deal with loans and all of those kinds of things. I sit on a board of a very progressive foundation, and our theory these days is that instead of doing long, complicated applications and all of that, as you said, many nonprofits they don't have the people power to be able to respond. We do very simple applications, right? Because for us, it's all about the outcomes. What we're looking for is the outcomes in the end, right? And also our theory, I think, and probably your theory is too, those people closest to the problem, right, are the ones who know what the solutions are. And so the question is, how do we get the state to think in those terms as well? Because, it's got to be transformative, right? Because the mindset has to be one that we trust the agencies, whether they're public or private, right, or nonprofit. We trust them to with the public's funds, right, to do the right thing. But the way we figure that all out is in the outcomes, right?
Absolutely.
And not just widgets, right? We're not counting widgets, right? Hopefully anymore. That we're really looking at, what did we improve in the community? So, okay.
I appreciate that. And many of these changes we're trying to accomplish with these partnerships are very long term. This is generational work, so it is harder to measure than other things might be of how it's going in any given moment. You mentioned the notion of the people closest to the problem know it best, and we absolutely stand by that. And that's part of the reasons that the nonprofit partners are often sought out, is because they are of by and for the very communities that government may be trying to help, assist, support, or work with in some fashion. For many years, I worked for an organization whose motto was change, not charity. Not that charity's bad, but simply if you don't work on the structural cause of why you need that charity in the first place, you'll never solve it. So I think that there's a lot there, but the good news is there are great examples of how that has worked over time. And so, appreciate that.
Thank you.
Commissioner Beyer.
Thank you for your testimony. And I want to really focus on Commissioner Erner's set of questions, because I think she's spot on in a political sense. Many of the things that you've proposed, and frankly, in some cases, in the violence against women, we recommended and it got enacted into law. That is advance payment instead of waiting until you've done the activity. I'd love to see more of that, but the trade-off is an improvement on the enforcement side. So I think one of the challenges for staff is looking at both other states or municipalities and the federal government to determine whether there are tools that should be either adopted or used more frequently such as random audits as a substitute for a full audit after a 2 or 3 year contract. The opportunity for maybe better whistleblowing protection and that kind of investigatory tool. If there's something on the prevention side or the detection side, my view is that many members of the legislature will be more comfortable granting flexibility to the nonprofit community, but they can't accept the status quo where it seems like good or well-intentioned programs for the homeless, and I'm channeling San Francisco here, or people, where there's a contract with the police department, but they've been engaged in fraud for years. So that's very hard to accept or stand up for if you're an elected official. But if you say, well, we've addressed that by having these 3 new tools, and they've been proven successful in other instances. So I would hope that you, with other philanthropies, would reach out to law enforcement and audit in state government and elsewhere to come up with proposals on the prevention detection side as the quid pro quo for your flexibility points.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I guess I would offer a couple of thoughts on that. One is that fraud is fraud, and nobody wants that in any sector, and we're right there with you. There are plenty of tools out there as they exist. I can't speak to the particulars of what's happened in San Francisco, since obviously that's made news, and here we are talking about it. So this is how that works. But the other reality is that there is an interesting tension in the way that nonprofits are approached with respect to funding. So they are simultaneously asked to spend as little as possible on internal controls, capacity, people, staffing, benefits, sustainability, and then simultaneously asked to go under a rigorous set of transparency, audits, et cetera. And I would argue that you can't have it that way. It doesn't work. So you can fully fund the work. And if you wanted to fully fund ways in which nonprofits might be able to build infrastructure that might make those kinds of situations less common, then I think most nonprofits would say that's great. And we have someone whose full-time job it is to talk to government or talk to other funding partners about how different projects are executed on. I will also say that the percentage of fraudulent cases is microscopic, and it is just as much as it is in any other sector. The problem is it makes news. And so what we need to do, I think, is really find a way to get those same kind of checks and balances you'd have in any other sector operating fully. And yeah, when a bad actor is there, it's there. The problem is we don't talk about all the other work, generally speaking, and the public generally doesn't know the difference between who's doing that work. It's not, oh, that's a nonprofit, this is a for-profit. It's simply, this is who's working in my community. So I certainly, no member of the nonprofit sector would ever defend any kind of fraudulent behavior, but we need to find a way to wrap those kinds of checks and balances in a structure where there's capacity to do it, which we absolutely would welcome, and then have government begin to trust, as any funding partner should, what's working once they see it. And I think that's it. I mean, one of the things that many don't realize is the amount of information asked of nonprofits, that the sheer baseline transparency with our work is above all others. So everything we do is essentially in the public trust. And that's how we are designed. We are the public trust. And so those documents, those reports, they can all be found. Sometimes, I think from where we sit, it's a matter of organizing that information, meaning reports may have been submitted for years and years to a particular agency. Did anyone look at them? We don't know. So I think having some infrastructure, and I think one of my predecessors here in commentary this morning mentioned, can you build an infrastructure internal to government that actually functions better in that way, so that they're prepared to be the kind of partner that can look for things like that. So appreciate that.
Thank you.
Commissioner Hernandez.
Good morning, everyone. I just want to reemphasize, I mean, the previous 2 commissioners right on the dot in terms of politics does not mess everything up, but put an extra layer into the politics. But at the same time, I mean, I think that Mr. Green's correct in terms of the onus shouldn't always be on the nonprofit. that one of my pet peeves is when you have a chunk of money, you want it to go to services, you want it to actually go out there, and right at the top, 5-10% goes to admin, right at the top, 5-10% goes to oversight to make sure that the money is being spent correctly, and then you have more percentages. So in that, if we are trying to make government more efficient, and if we're trying to address fraud and trying to prevent any malfeasance, I mean, are there lessons learned from philanthropy in the sense of philanthropy gives out money to nonprofits? What are some checks and balances they do? A lot of times they don't have all these onerous reports and so forth. What's something that maybe we can do? And then two, I know we're always talking about AI in terms of kind of other lessons learned there that can really help. And I was always thinking too, in terms of the energy world, credit rating is always something. Is there a way maybe from the Cal nonprofits overall create maybe a rating system for nonprofits that assures either philanthropy or government in terms of their investment? I know a couple of years ago, there is now this Golden Navigator or Navstar, now some database that starts collecting that information. And is that kind of a direction we should go in terms of legitimizing the nonprofit and ensuring the effectiveness of the programs and services? Thank you,
Commissioner. I would say to your second point, the best one that's out there right now is actually the one that's done by Candid GuideStar, and that's the transparency seal. So what that is simply doing is the more information you're willing to disclose and able to share, and the more documentation you can offer, you basically get a transparency seal. It's, bronze, silver, gold, platinum. And the sector largely embraces that. And it does take larger capacity organizations to really calculate some of those reports and those data and statistics. But that gets back to your first point, which is we would welcome the ability to do more of that. But because the pressure longstanding has been to do as little of that as possible, the whole notion of I want all of this $100 donation to go toward the program, none of it to go toward the staff who do the program. And of course, the question then is, well, how do you think the program gets done if you're not paying the staff? So I think if we were to normalize some indirect costs to things like basic reporting, monitoring, many organizations, every nonprofit leader I know, probably without exception, would love to have the capacity to learn more about their own work in real time and adjust. They tend to do it whenever they can and on the fly, but if there were actual resources being given, that would only improve, I think. And to Commissioner Byers' earlier comment, really, if you look at the way these bills that we've pushed have gone through, first of all, they've all passed unanimously, and I'll speak in a moment on specifically what we've been working with the legislature on. But having that capacity and having these sort of better contracting practices in place would do nothing but improve all of these issues that are being brought up. So I think these are actually rowing in the same direction if we could get to better practices and relationship.
Thank you. Commissioner Erner?
Yes. Just to follow up, I also sit on the board of a very large child welfare agency, probably the largest one in the state. And one of our issues, and I'm interested in hearing from you, is what's the definition of partnership between the public sector and the private nonprofit? Because it has to be something where there is cooperation and respect on both sides. And because for some agencies, they would love to partner with the public sector, but the public sector doesn't know what the word partner means, right? They think that means control, for example, right? Whatever. And so I'm interested in hearing from the nonprofit world what your definition of partnership really is.
My definition would be that it's common work with an aligned mission and an understanding of who's going to do what part of the work. And I think it can look like strictly funding, although I think probably in some ways that's the areas where it's least connected. If it's just writing a check to a nonprofit to do a job, on one hand, sure, that's a partnership, but that's really just sort of contracting out. The better examples that we've seen are things where there are specific roles to be done, and the public sector says, we've got the capacity and the infrastructure to do this piece, but for example, we can't reach that part of the community. Could you partner, help us, work with us? And as you said, I think understanding that partnership doesn't mean we're going to just tell you what to do. That's that could sort of control and empower power imbalance, but actually partner and listen to what you know best. Getting back to this notion of those on the ground, those closest to the problem, often know best what could actually solve it. And so if that trust is there going both ways, you know, the nonprofit partner trusting that the government has the interest and capacity, and then we share a goal. And then the government says, yes, we understand that you have a different way of working, a different structure, but we know that you can actually reach these folks that we're unable to reach. That happens in a lot around language barriers. It can happen. It can happen for you know, folks recently released from incarceration who are much less likely to want contact with governmental or law enforcement or agencies. It can be with youth. There's lots of places where nonprofits can build these trusted relationships and extend the reach of government and be a good partner. And I think as long as both sides understand what we're here to do, and there's an understanding that it's not just going to be, we're going to tell you how to do it our way. And frankly, in either direction, that's the best partnership. And sometimes it's money, sometimes it's not. I mean, there are partnerships that are not funded partnerships. They're simply sharing of resources and information to get something done. So we're big fans of that too. If no questions, Mr. Chair, just one thing I would like to end on is a couple of the comments on our most recent legislative efforts, and just so that the commission's aware of kind of where we've ended in this last session.
Yeah, I'd like to hear that, because it seemed to me that you have legislators who understand some of the challenges that you've identified for us, and there was apparently a lack of agreement with the governor called a veto, and so I do think that I want to hear more about that, because I think it sort of helps us to understand, you know, when we frame recommendations, we want to be as practical as possible. We're aspirational, but I also think that part of our success is that we're realistic in terms of evaluating what is likely to fly, and trying to maximize the possibility that it'll turn into a bill that gets signed. And so you've had, I think, some disappointments the last go round that I'd like to learn more about.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. I'm happy to share where we've come. So I'll back up even a little bit and say that it was 2017 when, working with Speaker Rendon at the time, we were able to float this notion of a select committee on the nonprofit sector, and the Speaker was very supportive. And then working with legislators, it was actually at the time Assemblywoman Limon who stepped in to chair that first select committee. And then when she was elected over to the Senate, then she began it there as well in 2021. So we actually started holding joint hearings back then. And at one of those hearings, so just a few years ago, a list of recommendations really emerged about how might we fix or improve some of these norms with contracting. And so in this last session, so 2023, 2024, we had a good number of willing and even excited legislators to help carry a range of bills. We put together a package of 7 bills working with the legislature. We called it the Nonprofit Equity Initiative, and then mobilized our membership and nonprofits across the state who work with government at all levels to sort of advocate for, help shape, and ultimately push these bills through the legislature. In the end, 3 bills passed unanimously through both houses. And you could say 4 because one passed twice. It was vetoed once and then it was vetoed again. We'll talk about that in a moment. But these were all around contracting. So essentially, they fell into a few buckets. One was this notion of advanced pay, and that was really the big win. So AB 590, carried by Assemblymember Hart, got a signature from Governor Newsom last fall, 2023. So that is law as of this year on the books. And this is the one that explicitly empowered agencies to give up 25% of any grant or contract in advance. Now, that language was written permissively, and this is now the challenge, is that we knew that in order to get that level of support, that this would be the right framing. The problem is it is not required. And so to move it from simply empowerment and a model and a good idea into wide adoption across all agencies, that is where we stand now. We have some great examples. And in fact, Strategic Growth Council was one of the models we used of what they had already been doing and experimenting with. So we modeled that again. These are not new ideas. It's sort of things already done, but in small, isolated places, pockets. So that's AB 590. The others that got to the governor's desk. Senator Limon carried first. It was 557, and then this year nearly identical bill 1246. This was simply closing really inequitable, unfair language in the Prompt Payment Act. And it essentially exempts nonprofits from being subject to prompt payment or to reporting of when payments weren't prompt or to penalties. And so we simply said, let's bring nonprofit contractors up to at least equal treatment with for-profit contractors. And it's hard to even imagine why that would have once been considered okay that they were not, but that's the law. And so that was not done. That was the bill that was vetoed twice. The third area was simply getting California, in this case now, really caught up with the federal government. Some of you may know that the OMB issued new guidance in April of this year that set a new de minimis rate for indirect costs at a federal level to 15%. And California still does not have that. And so this bill, carried by Senator Umberg, it was Bill SB 336, would have simply put California in parity with the federal government. So a 15% de minimis rate, or other options if there's already negotiated rates. Obviously, different kinds of work have different levels of infrastructure and indirect costs required. Unfortunately, that bill was also vetoed by Governor Newsom. Now, all of these bills were passed unanimously through both houses of the legislature and then vetoed. And in the veto message this year, essentially, the governor's only reasoning was that there were potentially costs affiliated with these, and in a down budget year, this would be costly. We take issue with that because, frankly, anything to improve efficiency is a savings in cost. And I feel that, given the data that we're seeking and are seeking now, we could demonstrate that clearly, that in fact, these would not be increased costs. They would be net savers to the government. That said, those were the ones that were vetoed. The other bill that went through twice, didn't make it to the governor's desk, was a micro grants or a small grants bill. And this is simply to say that any grant under a certain amount should just be paid up front, just remove the barriers. And we're talking grants that, frankly, the cost of the staff time to write the grant, to move money, to monitor the grant probably exceeds the grant itself. We're talking really small grants. So why not just move those dollars? You, of course, request all of the after the fact reporting that you would normally ask for. And of course, you do your vetting up front, but you don't then add the additional burden of slow or reimbursement only models. So those were the things that were largely the focus during this last session, and that was the outcome. So the big win for us was AB 590, and the next step on that, and again, getting to what you've begun to propose and speak with your staff about, is this notion of, can we get a map of the lay of the land of what's actually happening across agencies currently in the state government? Can we get a sense from nonprofits of their experience of that? And then we'll know kind of where we can do the most work and get the most mileage out of any effort to normalize the notion of advance payment. And again, this is only 25% advance payment. This isn't just giving the money and hope for the best. This is just get some resources, some capital deployed at the front end so that the work can start immediately, and then monitor as you normally would along the way. And that seems to all of us, and apparently to the vast majority of the legislature, as a sort of no-nonsense, common sense way to do better contracting. Some of these things, and one of the things I will note is that if you look at the guidance, actually federal and state, it does not say that reimbursement should be the norm. That it actually says quite the opposite. The assumption is that advance pay and these other sort of moving money efficiently are the norm, and that reimbursement is sort of last resort as necessary. What we know in practice is that, in fact, it's the reverse, and that for various reasons, most of them cultural, structural, nothing particularly nefarious as far as we can tell. It's just that, we just got in the habit of this is how we do it. And of course, there's a financial incentive. The longer any entity holds on to dollars, the more dollars they have to maneuver and earn interest on or what have you. So that has unfortunately become the habit and the norm. And what we're proposing is that be reversed.
Thank you. Commissioner Byer.
This is an important conversation, and a suggestion, which would be get one or more of the larger philanthropies to put together a group that would include smaller philanthropies, that is, people less than $2.5 million who are not undergoing regular audits, and then a tranche of people who are newly in the audit category, and come up with best practices with an eye on how the state can assure the public of competence and compliance. Because what I worry about is, if the governor's stuck in a place, you need new people to come in and say, there is a better way to do this that can achieve the social goal that we want, and that you, by creating the liaison that we heard about from Ms. Janus before, it could work better if we put in place these new rules and have somebody outside the legislature take a look at the issue with fresh eyes and make recommendations to the governor about how he can be for something, as opposed to waiting to the end of the legislative process after bills have passed unanimously for him to veto once again. Because going the legislative route with the same arguments doesn't seem like it's going to work.
Well, I mean, I think that may well be that there needs to be a different or more messengers. I think that's part of why we're here speaking to you all this morning. I think, having the commission and among others be one of those messengers to say, this is the evidence. This works. It saves money. It's more efficient. I think that there's plenty out there that is demonstrable. But if as Commissioner Byers said, maybe there's a different messenger or a group of messengers to join the cause, I would never suggest that's a bad thing. I think the data that whatever survey can be gathered that, to sort of show the map. There are those who go by the stories and the narrative, and then those who want to see the data. And most of us want a little bit of both.
If you surveyed, I'm willing to bet, the philanthropies the governor's office facilitated projects with, and asked them what their experience is with their own grantees, what kind of scrutiny they engage in, and whether these practices of advance payment, of permitting certain kind of practices, is consistent with fiscal responsibility, most of them would say, yes, it's standard practice in our larger philanthropy world to have smaller nonprofits do things. Here's how we relate to them. And we're good stewards of our money. And we're highly regulated, and the state could do the same thing. And then you've got people the governor has already expressed trust in, telling him maybe you could do it a different way.
No, I appreciate that. I would totally agree. The notion of having other messengers, especially other funders, say this is what's normal, this is what works, and this is what we know. One of the reports that was issued just this June, a better funding report, I believe it may be in your materials, essentially is some of that message coming from other funders about this is why we do it this way and what works. So I think building that and building a cadre of other foundations and funders that are maybe partners already to the state to help deliver that message and say this works, it is the better way, and here's our experience with it. We would certainly support that. And frankly, coming from you as well, with whatever survey work you choose to do, that would be our big ask of you, is to help us carry that message. Since clearly we don't have a lot of legislators we have to convince. Folks get it intuitively. We now just have to get it all the way across the finish line into a new cultural norm.
Commissioner Sidley.
So thank you very much for your testimony today. I appreciate it. I just want to clarify a point that what you're talking about is a 25% upfront payment of monies that have been already approved. Right. So I'm not exactly getting the connection of the impact to the budget, because the monies have been approved, and it's just a matter of timing, unless somebody's looking at the float from the interest rate. Is that specifically? I mean, am I sort of just getting what you're saying, and maybe that's why the legislature voted unanimously for this, and then there's a disconnect for me, and I just want to, am I missing something, or is it just that?
No, it's just that. I mean, so AB 590 was the one that empowered the 25% advance pay, and that did get the governor's signature. And so that is currently empowerment. Of course, one could debate was that even needed, because there is a history of doing this, and there's been previous legislation on individual programs to do it, and it's worked brilliantly, and we've seen the evidence. But yes, this is sort of the broad open door encouragement to please use this model whenever possible. I think on the others, it is and we've been told by individuals certainly that, yeah, the longer you hold on to dollars, that's better for the funding agency. So we get that. I mean, it's somewhat cynical to think that should drive policy. But that is the reality, that yes, that seems to be one of the reasons for the sort of de facto notion that only reimbursement and as late as possible, which certainly, without any particular values or thought of what we're trying to accomplish, that makes sense from a purely fiscal perspective. But if you're actually trying to get something done, it does not work. So,
Thank you.
Thank you. Geoff, I want to give you an opportunity. I don't see any other hands from commissioners, but I give you an opportunity to have something that you wanted to say to wrap up.
I'll just say again, I really appreciate the fact that this is on your agenda, that you're seeing this as an issue worthy of some serious look and work. And in fact, we're here to be a partner. So if there's something we can provide along the way into connecting with the nonprofit sector, offering examples, we certainly have those. As far as surveying the sector itself, should you choose to go that direction. And of course, we would love to see a lay of the sort of the state landscape of which entities, which agencies and departments are actually already doing this, considering it, and if not, why not? So that we can help to move this along. So that's really where we're at. I think contracting, this is not the only state where these issues arise, and there is a movement across the country among our nonprofit partners. We are in close contact with other state advocacy organizations. So we're not alone here, and it's always good to see California in the lead. So if we can get to a place where this is the norm, fewer barriers, more effective partnerships, because in the end, we're talking about the same work that we all want to see done. So the nonprofit sector is here, ready, willing, and able, and we appreciate the time and effort you're putting in this.
Thank you very much, Geoff. Appreciate your testimony.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing you again soon.
Likewise.
Crystal, do we have somebody on deck?
Mr. Chairman, our next witness is Don Howard, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer of the James Irvine Foundation. Welcome, Mr. Howard. When you're ready, please unmute yourself and start your video.
Hello. Sound
Hello.
and video okay?
We can hear you fine. Thank you.
Great, great. It's good to see you, Chairman Nava. Thanks, commissioners, for inviting me to come along to testify. I have some prepared remarks. If it's okay, I'll try to get through those. I'll take questions along the way, and then we can get into more of a discussion. Is that okay, Chairman Nava?
Yeah, I think as you've seen, if you've watched any of the hearing, these commissioners can be quite unruly. And if they've got a question they want to ask you, they're going to raise
totally
their
good.
hand. There you go. Perfect. Thank you.
I'll keep an eye out for it. So I just want to say thank you on behalf of the foundation for inviting us to speak here. And I just want to thank you for your service. I think public service goes too often underappreciated. My mom was a public servant, and just appreciate what you're doing. So I'm Don Howard. For folks I haven't met, I have the privilege of being president and CEO of the James Irvine Foundation. For folks who don't know us, the Irvine Foundation was funded and created by James Irvine, who in 1937 put a little more than half of the value of the Irvine Ranch and Company into the foundation. We are no longer associated with any family or company. There's a whole backstory there, but we are an independent private philanthropy. And our endowment right now stands at about $3.3 billion. And this year we plan to make grants of about $159 million to organizations that are working in California on what we consider our singular goal. I just want to be clear here, we're not like other institutions that have multiple program areas. We are all in on ensuring that every low-income California worker has the power to advance economically. So you can think of us as an economic justice, economic equity, economic mobility institution. And, the state needs more equitable paths to the middle class. We know that the American California dream is dwindling for many folks, out of reach. And that's why we set the goal that we do for our work. It's when we get to the topic of public-private partnerships or partnerships with the state, I just want to sort of bring, if it hasn't already been said, government spending so far exceeds philanthropic resources, but we can play an important role that it's complementary to public resources, particularly ensuring that the people who are most often left out and left behind are heard and can participate in shaping government policies. So that's the perspective we bring to why we partner with the public sector. California is confronting a ton of complex challenges that disproportionately affect low-income workers, their communities, particularly workers in communities of color. The multifaceted issues that we confront, they really require collaboration across sectors and the requirement to develop sustainable and equitable solutions. That's why we've been grateful to partner with the governor and his staff and the state more broadly to be able to create those collaborations. The public sector brings unmatched resources to the problems through its funding and through its agencies. But there are limits to what governments can fund, how far it can go to implement programs, and how well it can reach those most in need. So that's where philanthropy comes in. Philanthropic institutions can fund efforts that foster experimentation, improve implementation of policies and programs, and importantly, increase community engagement. So we have examples of this in California, and the state really should be proud of what's been accomplished. It is a model that others can learn from. And I hear from my colleagues, CEOs around the country, that California has a well-functioning approach to public-private partnerships with the governor and the executive branch. So I just want to highlight that. We are seen by many as a model and best in class in this arena. And I think it's something that we can be proud of. And I want to really appreciate Governor Newsom for creating a position to have the Senior Advisor for Social Innovation. That's Elena Chavez-Quezada. She facilitates collaboration across foundations and the state government in order to create strategies and collaborations and approaches for us to work together to approach trying to solve California's most acute problems. And we really have found those collaborations to be genuine, meaningful partnerships. I know many that aren't in other orders. And the work we do together, we believe, can make a real difference for the people of California. If I have something that I want to, someone call out here, it's my fellow philanthropists and the foundations in California. Many more of them should engage in this work, and I can share some reasons later for why I think that's a challenge. In fact, it really requires understanding the inherent challenges to pursuing public-private partnerships. I can share three just to get our conversation going. First, both sectors often have relatively narrow priorities, which should totally be expected, but they may not align. And when they don't, it makes it difficult to find common ground. Really effective partnership comes when we find common ground together. We'll speak later to co-creation, why that's important. A second challenge is bureaucracy and institutional constraints on both sides can hinder flexibility and nimbleness, making it hard to take advantage of timely opportunities. In this administration, the Senior Advisor for Social Innovation has helped philanthropy navigate those constraints. Again, I hope we in philanthropy can navigate our own constraints and get out of our own way in public-private partnerships. The third constraint or challenge is there's often a misconception, particularly on the part of foundations, about what philanthropy can legally do with the government and how to proceed. So I know I talked to Crystal about this. I think it was helpful to provide a little framing for the different types of partnerships as we see them from our vantage point. So let me provide some examples. So there's 4 categories that we see these partnerships fall into. One is direct funding, a second is co-funding, a third is coordinated funding, and the fourth is technical assistance. So let me sit through each one of those 4 and give you an example.
Mr. Howard, before.
Yes, is there a question?
Yeah, if you would be so kind, Commissioner Sidley.
So thank you, Mr. Howard. I appreciate your time. I want to first call out one of your employees, Andre Oliver, who I worked with, and I love him and just so great at what he does. So we worked together and met during the Clinton administration. So just wanted to throw that out there as how proud I am to know him and the work he is doing along with the work that you're doing. I just want to build on something, and maybe that you'll weave this in as you continue to testify. Did you have to seek out the state, or is it well publicized how to work with the state? You talk about the state being a leader, and I'd like to continue with that idea. And so, how is the word out there that we're a leader and that it's easy to work with the state, or do you have to really say, I want to do this, and then go find them? And then if that's the case, how do we improve upon that?
Thanks for the question, and thanks for the feedback about Andre, who I also have a ton of appreciation for. It is relatively easy to know that the door is open for partnerships with the state. The position of Senior Advisor for Social Innovation did not exist under the previous administration, And I remember specifically some areas where we wanted to collaborate, and it took some door knocking, and it led to far fewer collaborations. So having a point person, there's also an annual philanthropy summit that gets convened where leaders from across California's philanthropies come together. It's a great chance for us to talk. We get to meet some of the agency officials, secretaries and such to hear what the priorities are. And I think that forum really has created a safe space, if you will, or a comfortable space for folks to talk about how to collaborate. So I don't see a need for improving the outreach here in California. I do think, and this is, just jump right to it, a recommendation I might have for you all is this position of Senior Advisor for Social Innovation should be persistent beyond administrations. And it hasn't been. And I think that sort of up and down of whether philanthropy has an open door to go through hinders our ability to do this long term. We've looked at various forms of collaboration and partnership that extend, we hope, well beyond this administration's term. But I do worry that in a new administration, this might be deprioritized for any host of reasons. I don't know what the power is of the commission to recommend something like this, but I hope the next administration keeps a position like this and has a commitment, as this administration does, to find ways to partner with philanthropy. Do you want me to call folks out?
Oh, I'm sorry. No, I was
Hernandez.
No, I was muted. Yeah, Mr. Hernandez. Commissioner Hernandez.
Mr. Howard, thank you. I also want to take time and recognize some of your unparalleled staff in terms of the work.
God.
Charles Field.
Charles, he's our executive vice president.
Exactly. You stole him from a foundation down here, and so good job for that. But I think you mentioned something, and that's exactly what we do in terms of making recommendations. And so not only is that a great recommendation in terms of longevity of key positions in terms of facilitating this work, but also I wanted to know, you probably will, since we cut you off, expanding on the misconceptions. I think that's critical, both in terms of the administration and also the legislature, on how we can help also address some of those misconceptions.
Yeah, let me see if I can address it right now. I think there are among some foundations, I mean, I hate to generalize, but many foundations are risk averse. And so getting into contact with electeds and their cabinets, I think folks are fearful that they are going to be somehow sort of drawn into a political activity. Just to know, independent foundations are nonpartisan by law, do not engage in electoral politics or electioneering around policies. So the fearfulness or some of the misunderstandings are, how do I potentially partner with an agency on a program without feeling like I might cross a line into politicking? So I think it takes understanding, like, what do we really mean by this, and some kind of reps in trying how to do it. The other challenge, and sometimes a misperception, is that foundations could become a ATM for public programs. And I think this is a place that I hear from other CEOs, which is like, well, why can't they pay for that? And I think it takes some understanding of the limits that public funds can be used. And it is tremendous leverage as we see it. And I'll give an example in a minute, where we can basically provide glue money, fill in the gaps where state funding can't be used. And in particular, an example is state dollars often don't go far enough to engage community members in a truly meaningful, authentic way. And that is a unique role that philanthropy can play. Those are our grantees. And I speak from this foundation's perspective. Our grantees are eager to work on issues of economic mobility and economic justice. And they need the capacity and resources to do that. We can provide resources, the sort of dollars as well as technical assistance for them to engage. That's a lot harder for the state to do directly, depending on how the legislation and the program has been implemented. So those are a few of the misperceptions. And I think folks, the other is, sad to say, there's a lot of not invented here in philanthropy. Folks have their sort of approaches, and sometimes an opportunity with the state requires flexibility and being willing to go outside that lane. And I think that's one of the sort of misperceptions folks have. Like, it doesn't have to be directly your program strategy. think more expansively. This is a tremendous opportunity for scale and leverage. We can't do it alone in philanthropy. So partnerships with the state are, I mean, in my opinion, if you want to, we've set these bold aspirations. Any chance of achieving them requires collaboration with the public sector.
Thank you. You had started to identify 4.
Yeah. So let me give you 4 different sort of ways to think about this. And I think this is sort of what Crystal may have said was valuable. So I'll spend a minute sort of, I think they were in the written testimony. I'm sure they were. One is direct funding, where we provide money directly to a state agency. One is co-funding, where we mingle resources toward a common goal. One is coordinated funding, where we go about our business separately, but it's on a common objective, and we find ways to coordinate the relative activities of the state and philanthropy. And then the 4th is technical assistance, where we can provide consultants or advisors that can help the state go about implementing a program that we think is really important to do. Plenty of examples, but I'll try to here just be brief. In the category of direct funding to a state agency, we provided a grant to the Strategic Growth Council, California's Strategic Growth Council, in 2023 to help community coalitions through the Connected Communities program more effectively secure federal climate change funds that they would typically miss out on. So this is a place where we can help through SGC. They have an existing program. It can be expanded to more community-based organizations and coalitions. So they have the opportunity to pull down these amazing resources from the bipartisan infrastructure law or the Inflation Reduction Act or any number of the state programs as well. So that's an example of directly funding an agency. A second example, co-funding. That's where we blend to some degree. There's some mechanical sort of constraints to blending, but where we commit funds directly to the same cause. So this happens often in crisis situations, earthquake and wildfire recovery. We did this alongside a program to increase the skills of agricultural workers, where the state had an interest, we had an interest. We focus on low-wage workers. The state's committed to expanding apprenticeships beyond traditional fields. We think apprenticeships are the gold standard of workforce development. So our ability to then coordinate, collaborate here, co-fund here, apprenticeship models, something we've done. Here's one that I think just speaks to some of the scale opportunities. And again, somewhat in a crisis. We and the state set up a fund for services for unaccompanied child migrants arriving at the southern border. And that's where philanthropy contributed $12 million and the state contributed $25 million. And that 12 million was leveraged 2 to 1 and was on an issue that we cared about. It was also a bit of a crisis, which is where people are a little more nimble in their willingness to work together. But I think that serves as a real example of where we both bring resources together toward a common cause. So that's co-funding. Coordinated funding is where we work on a similar cause or a similar project, but we do not pool the funds. We coordinate our grant making toward that goal. So I'll give you an example there. In 2021, Governor Newsom and his team launched what was called the Community Economic Resilience Fund, or CERF, C-E-R-F. It's now called California Jobs First, and it funds 13 regions. The state was divided into 13 regions. It provides funding to each region for them to coalitions in these communities to develop blueprints for creating high quality jobs of the future that are more accessible to residents and lead to a more inclusive and better paying economy. So this is a kind of economic development planning that's bottoms up versus top down. This is something that we have embraced from before this program was launched. We were funding a similar effort in Fresno called Fresno Drive and funding an effort in the Inland Empire called IEGO. The governor and his team took that to scale, if you will. And this is a great example of where we had provided somewhere, say, $2 to $4 million. And then the governor created a program that was a $600 million commitment to scaling this across 13 regions and having community members sitting at a table with higher ed, sitting at the table with business, sitting at the table with chambers of commerce, workforce development groups, and saying, what do we want in our local economy, our regional economy going forward? Fewer, frankly, low quality jobs, more high quality jobs, and taking into account things like climate change, technological change, et cetera. So we were all in this conceptually. And what we were able to do in philanthropy, sort of in parallel to this program, was set up a fund, purely philanthropic, called the California Economic Mobilization Initiative, or CEMI, CME for short. We did that with the Center at Sierra Health Foundation, kind of the home for this. So CME assists nonprofits who are sitting at those tables to do that planning. And the resources that we put in collectively in philanthropy were regranted to community-based organizations. So if you're a immigrant serving organization in a place like Salinas, and you want to be part of the table that's coalition in Salinas to chart new directions for the economy, you might have a budget of $600,000. You may not have half an FTE to devote to this process. You may not have the technical skills to sit there and say, no, wait a second, here's what a high value job is. And you want to level the playing field. So philanthropy put resources together, created this fund called CME, and then regranted dollars. And that was in parallel to the state's effort with California Jobs First. So I think of that as one of the really best examples of where we've coordinated funding. A second example I'll share is around the 2020 US Census. 45 funder partners, foundations and other funders, put $26 million together into a fund to support nearly 500 organizations across the state to do community outreach and engagement around the census to help get the counts as high as they could be in communities, particularly those that are historically undercounted. Alongside that 26 million, the state allocated $100 million, the legislature did, for similar outreach to get the count to be as accurate as possible. So those are examples of where we coordinated, but we didn't mingle any of our resources. And the last, let me lay out and then take questions, is what we call technical assistance to state and local agencies. And this can take different forms. You heard from Kathleen Janus this morning, I understand. One kind of technical assistance is funding a consulting firm that can help support the work of the Senior Advisor for Social Innovation in doing that outreach to philanthropy. And philanthropy funds that firm to provide that support. So that's direct technical assistance to the state to execute one of its functions that the resources didn't exist for. So those are the four categories I put out. I think Crystal said that was a nice way to maybe kind of categorize stuff. Happy to take questions.
Mr. Byer, I see.
Yes, thank you very much. The Irvine Foundation has a well-deserved reputation for being innovative and entrepreneurial, and your testimony establishes that in multiple different ways. I looked at the list of the largest philanthropies in the United States, and if I'm not mistaken, Irvine is 49th. There are several others who are bigger in California. And so what I'm wondering is, what are the key learnings you have in dealing with two different kinds of foundations? One, I'll call them traditional single donor foundations, Packard, Hewlett, versus community foundations like Marin, San Francisco, California Community Foundation. What are the differences you have experienced in dealing with them to knit together joint funding activities from philanthropy in the four categories you talked about? In other words, they have different missions. You all have a single mission that is an advantage, I think. But you have a lot of experience in dealing with government in these four ways that you've described. They probably don't. And so how do you get them on board with, and we'll use the community regional economic development example you gave, because we as the Little Hoover Commission did an entire study on exactly that program. So we know that one. So, and it seemed very successful in terms of spreading some money to different regions to be able to put together plans. Well, that started with, if I'm not mistaken, with you all cooperating with the state. How do you get the other philanthropies to buy into the vision, and what are the impediments you've seen that they operate under?
There's an old saw, you've seen one foundation and you've seen one foundation, that there are such distinctions between us. Living donors, you mentioned, family foundations, mega family foundations, community foundations, which actually have a different legal structure and can engage in activities that, and then there's asset levels. I appreciate the positive feedback. Share it with my team. The fact that we have one goal and it is entirely focused on California. Mr. Irvine left us a number of benefits, a number of assets. One was he insisted we only do grant making for California in California. So that means we're highly aligned. And our singular goal around economic empowerment for low-wage workers was very aligned with the governor's agenda as well. So it's easier for us to find places of overlap than it might be for other institutions who have a health program, global population and climate program. You know, just these distinctions that aren't going to have quite the alignment with what the governor is trying to achieve, or the executive branch, we should be more careful, are trying to achieve. There are other California-focused foundations like the California Endowment or the California Healthcare Foundation, and they do have points of contact in their areas that I'm familiar with. So I think you have to screen for not just asset size, but type of foundation and the goals that they have. Some of them have global goals, which just aren't going to connect here. Might connect, I mean, there's a number of us, ourselves included, who are trying to collaborate with the federal government around issues that are national. We're trying to bring some of those resources to California, so that's our goal. But I think it depends on sort of what the focus and type of the foundation is. I haven't found anybody who said, I don't want to do this. What I have found are folks who say, oh, it's not quite what we're doing. Or, it's going to take a lot of time and we're going to have to be flexible. And I think that is some of the behavior of my colleagues. We do around that CME fund, for instance, which was sort of in parallel to Serve for California Jobs First. That included 6 or 7 different philanthropies. I will proudly say we seeded the fund in the first place and invited others to contribute. But that was a place where we were able to bring other philanthropy into it. So it happens in places. It happens sometimes pairwise, sometimes in larger groups. I do, the question of how you would equip other foundations to do this is a tough one, because we are in a kind of field that's unaccountable in large degree. We have to hold ourselves accountable. A friend of mine used to say, colleague, mentor, excellence in philanthropy is self-imposed. And so I think that sort of getting into those institutions and helping them be better equipped it's hard to find the entry point. And a lot of it is with us. So the CEOs of institutions and holding us to task to be better partners where we can be with the state and with other collaborators across this kind of ecosystem.
Yeah, one example of a positive public-private partnership that I know of is Mark Benioff gave $10 million for a telepsychiatry program to UCSF that is to educate pediatricians on signs and symptoms of mental health problems in children. The state then followed up with $50 million to expand the program statewide. And then that's in turn going to be wrapped into the governor's Prop 1 funding on mental health. So there are ways you can start with a relatively modest contribution and leverage the money. That story doesn't get told very often, which is a shame, because I think philanthropies oftentimes don't see the leverage of their own money in the way that you do. And so good on you. And I hope that you succeed even more.
Well, I do think getting some of the case studies down will be helpful in order to sort of, have others understand how it can be done. You speak to an example of a living benefactor who can be directly sort of lobbied, if you will, to do a donation and fits in their particular worldview and provides a great opportunity. This again, one foundation, like that is cool. It's great that he gets to make those decisions. I think lifting up some of these examples would help. And that's, I think, what Jim Ferris, and I know you spoke with him earlier, that's his area of research. And he's been a passionate advocate for these sorts of partnerships for a long time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So would it be helpful if maybe I share some of the lessons that we've learned?
Yeah, I think that would be helpful. Thank you.
Okay. So there's a few more in the written materials, but I wanted to sort of be as concise as possible. I think, first we have learned we should align grant making wherever possible. It's most effective when we share common goals and we align our work. Pooling resources is more complicated. So I think this area of coordinating and aligning our work And Elena does a great job at finding those places and trying to serve them up. But I think that is a place where we've seen the greatest success. Second, it really requires building relationships, and so many things do. But I think in this instance, the senior advisor for social innovation has been great. She comes from philanthropy. She's super well respected. She has a wonderful approach to doing outreach. And I think that relationship building has just been more effective under this administration than under the Brown administration. The third, I'd say, is focus on co-creation. So people are in their silos. They have their not invented here kind of modalities. So starting with an objective and co-creating how the partnership or sort of the co-funding and coordinated funding can work. So start from the beginning rather than delivering up a project and saying, what do you like or what don't you like? I'd encourage my colleagues at other foundations to go beyond co-funding. There are other ways to be complementary to public programs. I mentioned technical assistance and capacity building of nonprofits as being one of them. You can fund evaluation of programs. You can fund some of the supports to get a program up and running. So I think that like being creative is important. And I would fifth, I'm not sure if this would work or not, but it's been long on my mind that this doesn't exist in the legislature. And it's a bit of a moving target. I might interact with a senator here, an assembly person there, and it's like, maybe there's an idea, and then it just kind of like dissipates. Maybe it's not possible given the distributed nature of the legislature to make this happen, but we never hear from the legislative branch, at least not in any coordinated way, about how we can collaborate. And I would hope there are some opportunities there. Last thing I'd say is crisis breeds opportunity. We did a lot more effective partnerships during the COVID crisis, during the immigration, waves of immigration crisis, during the wildfires. So the kind of the nimbleness, willingness to go outside your silos tends to happen more during kind of crisis moments. I don't wish any more crisis moments upon us. I suspect there will be, unfortunately, but I think those are the moments when we can come more closely together. I remember being on calls during COVID, constant calls around how do we pool resources around education, outreach for vaccines, supporting nonprofits who are going through, can't raise money, can't have their galas. So I think there's more opportunity when there's a crisis. But let me just end by saying, I really appreciate the governor's commitment. This is unique, as I said, nationally, and in my time at this institution across state administrations. And the effectiveness of the senior advisor for social innovation, I really can't understate that. She has been a tremendous partner and colleague. Proud to be able to work with her.
Thank you so very, very much. Let me take a look at the fellow commissioners. I don't see any other hands up. So no further questions. I want to thank you very much, Mr. Howard, for taking the time and sharing that information with us. I can tell from the way my commissioners are nodding their heads that they agree with me. I think you've been very helpful. And, best to you. Thank you.
Thank you for the time. Thank you for your service. And if there are follow-up questions, don't hesitate to reach out.
Yep, absolutely. And I should tell the commissioners, the agenda, indicates that there's going to be a break for lunch. We're not going to break for lunch. We have one more witness. And I'm sure that you'd rather hear from that person than go away and try to figure out how to come back. So Crystal, if you'd be so kind.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our final witness is Chet Pehrson-Hewitt, who is the CEO and president of the Sierra Health Foundation. He's also chair of the board of directors for the Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome, Mr. Hewitt. When you're ready, please unmute yourself and begin your testimony.
Thank you. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Thank you, commissioners. Honored to be here with you today. You've heard a little bit of my bio. I'm Chet Pehrson-Hewitt. I'm the president and CEO of the Sierra Health Foundation, which is the second oldest health conversion foundation west of the Mississippi. And this is a foundation was not created out of an individual's private wealth, but through the sale of a nonprofit health plan, which was then turned into a foundation. It is the forebearer of some of the largest health conversion foundations in America, including the California Endowment, the California Healthcare Foundation, and California Wellness. We are the model that gave life to this notion of health conversion foundations, of which there are now over 500 across the country. I'm also the founding CEO of the Center at Sierra Health, which is our operational arm, which engages and manages a number of public-private partnerships. I will share more about those with you and also share some of our experience, lessons learned, and to celebrate some of the successes that we have had through those partnerships as well. I've also provided some written testimony. I'm not going to just read that to you. I was told that you were looking to engage in conversation, and that's what I'm going to attempt to do, but I will be paraphrasing and following along the same line of thought that is presented in my written testimony. I also want to say, to ground this conversation, that I'm a former child welfare director in Alameda County. I'm also a former member of the California Welfare Directors Association because I ran health and human services, social services in Alameda County. Health is a separate entity in Alameda. And I start by framing it that way because I've also been on the other side of this equation as a senior executive, the most senior executive in a number of public-facing entities as well. I've been at the Sierra Health Foundation for 17 years now, previously at Annie Casey Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation out of New York as well. So a long history in this particular space. Let me share with you that I believe that public-private partnerships are an essential way of achieving the state's goals. Our mission is a healthful life for all Californians. And while that is a very broad topic, using our social determinants of health framework, which means we are more than just about treating illness, we are also focused on the promotion of wellness. And in my space around health, those are two different things, although they are interdependent strategies going forward. And so that allows us to work in a number of domains. We know that healthy economy, where communities where people are employed in living wage jobs, actually promotes health and well-being. We also know that education is a primary determinant of what your health status will be over the course of your life. And at the same time, we understand that safe streets and safe environments that allow people to go out and engage in activity that's healthy. Kids in parks, seniors who can walk in the streets are also very important as well. And so through our public-private partnerships, we have really endeavored not to just focus on disease burden, but to also focus on the things that we all know are important, the things that we enjoy having in our communities, safe spaces to live, work, and play. So with that grounding, let me begin by saying that we at Sierra Health Foundation, the center, have managed a number of public-private partnerships in which we are also investors in those partnerships. One of them, the largest, was the CCOP, which is the California COVID Outreach Project, as well as the Vaccine Equity Project, and where we led the state's efforts to actually build campaigns to get people to understand how to respond to the COVID crisis, but also to deal with the subsequent issues around vaccine hesitancy as well. We worked with the Governor's Office of Social Innovation. I heard my colleague Don Howard talking about Elena Casada, who has been an extraordinary individual in helping me promote this idea of public-private partnerships, building off the prior work of Kathleen Janus, who I believe you also heard from this morning, as an extension of that work going forward. We know that through that particular work, proceeds that we were able to work with high net worth individuals along to merge that along with federal funding and state funding, which resulted in a $100 million campaign to deal with the COVID crisis. Because of our network and connections to communities, on the media side, working with RSA, we were able to ensure that half of those dollars actually went to ethnic media, who crafted campaigns that were really targeted at those populations and geographies that we knew were not engaging in the vaccination, or where you had high rates of mortality and morbidity associated with COVID. The ability to combine our data and resources to more quickly pivot and understand where those investments would actually have the greatest bang for the proverbial buck was something that I believe came out of that particular partnership. Each entity philanthropy, community nonprofits, and the public sector, playing roles in which they had great resources, assets, and knowledge, actually led to a much better set of interventions than any of us would have been able to do otherwise. There's something really important about public-private partnerships that enhances the ability of government to meet its outcomes, but it also enhances the ability of philanthropy and of nonprofit community groups to achieve those as well. They say that great relationships are reciprocal, that we each have responsibilities to one another to make them effective. And I can tell you that we have seen that happen across a number of domains. We were also the administrative entity for the Region census in Region 6. And as you all know, the 2020 census was the first census that was all electronic. And so there was deep concerns about serious undercounts. But using the same model that we used in approach to COVID and activating some of the same community groups who had become part of our expansive network, groups who have trust in community and great, what we call walkabout, who can knock on doors and get responses. We were able to actually achieve the best census count in Region 6 in its history, despite the fact that that transition to electronic census was believed that would have resulted in undercounts in those particular regions as well. We have also seen similar progress around the fentanyl abuse, particularly the state opioid response project. We know how traumatic the fentanyl and opioid crisis has been in many communities of color and communities in our rural communities and in the far north of California. And through a partnership with the California Department of Health Services, using the state opioid response dollars that came down from the federal government, we've been able to reach hundreds and hundreds of grantees who are working in communities using their own innovation, their own special way of connecting to communities to achieve some remarkable results as well. And we have also learned to pivot when we need to. In one of the rounds of funding that we helped manage for the state, we noticed that we had very few requests for resources from Native American communities. Again, leveraging the health data that's in the hands of the state and our own sets of relationships with community groups, we were able to figure out which Native American groups could actually be successful in the work that we were proposing to undertake, to actually work with them around building some of the capacity so they could submit more creative applications. And over the course of a second round of funding, was able to ensure that resources actually made it to those parts of California that we knew were really suffering disproportionately in this particular work as well. Another outcome of a well-designed public-private partnership, where one of the most important characteristics are not the assets that we hold as each strata of the partnership, but in our ability to trust one another, to pivot quickly to lessons, to not be bound by orthodoxy, the assumptions we carry when we first start the work. As a great Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan says, you're entitled to your own opinions, not your own facts, and to find the facts and to follow those in ways that have benefited BIPOC communities across the state of California, whether it was COVID, census counts, or responding to the opioid epidemic as well. Through that work, we have learned some lessons. It has not always been perfect. It has not always been easy, but it has always been worth it. So let me share with you some of the things that we think would be very helpful as we think about expanding these kind of partnerships going forward before I take questions. First, we believe that there's still more work to be done in terms of the state's procurement and operational process in order to create more flexibility. One of the challenges we found in our work, since particularly in the first parts of it around COVID, which were leveraging federal dollars, is that the requirements between state and federal eligibility requirements are really quite different. Let me give you an example of one of which was insurance requirements in order to receive funding. many groups, after they applied, were not able to be reimbursed because they did not meet federal insurance requirements. Now, we as Philanthropy were able to put together a $1 million fund, working with Cal nonprofits. I believe you also heard from Geoff Green earlier today, but also has an insurance service, and was able to procure the insurance coverage necessary for folks to get paid for work they had already done. That's what I mean about pivoting, moving beyond orthodoxy, being innovative in our responses, because we knew that those community groups were doing a great work. Another lesson that we actually learned is that the state's funding infrastructure has to be more equitable in how it distributes risk. And by that I mean, when most of our state contracts are reimbursements, we know that we're asking nonprofits to actually float capital for the state until they can actually submit an invoice, which once approved may take some time before that reimbursement is received. That actually locks out a number of nonprofits we believe have the ability to deliver on the ultimate outcome, which is the impact that we want to have in communities, but may be much more limited because they don't have the financial resources to actually await repayment. We believe this is an issue which really needs to be addressed, because what we end up doing is leaving a lot of potential capacity on the sidelines simply because of the financial requirements as well. So, thinking about AB 590, the ability to actually do prepayments on the front end, not a mandate, that should be expanded. We also think about state loan funds that could be at lower interest rates than what nonprofits would get through private institutions, might be another way of actually managing that as well. Because if you combine that, which will be another point I want to make here, with the de minimis rate in California, which still hovers around 10%, and then the need to cover the cost of financing dollars that you're holding until reimbursements, you can see how that can put nonprofits, which are a central partner in this ecosystem, at great risk. We know in our businesses, layering on risk is not what you want to do, right? It is the equitable distribution of that risk, given the public good that we're trying to create, that we need to think about more within the models that we use going forward. I touched on this topic, but I just want to underscore it, the issue around the de minimis rate as well. As you are probably all aware, and I'm sure I've heard from my other colleagues, the Fed's moved, OMB moved the de minimis rate at the federal level to 15%. Strongly encourage California to do so as well. Nonprofit partners in these public-private partnerships cannot be underwriting the cost of doing business. We know and believe there should be strict requirements for reporting, strong financial backbones within these organizations, as well as the ability to collect data, which we believe is essentially important to this work as well. But we believe that the idea of expediting those particular payments or allowing for some upfront payments is really important. And we've also experimented with some fixed fee arrangements, which provide incentives for folks to drive down the costs. Similar building off of some of the pay it forward contracting work that has been done nationally. Also things that we should begin to explore and experiment with as well. Third, and I heard my colleague Don Howard talking about this, capacity building is essential, particularly if you want to get to under-resourced communities and populations as well. We started the center, and I said I was the founding director over 10 years ago, simply because we knew that some of the groups that we wanted to work with simply did not have the kind of infrastructure to collect data for reporting and evaluation, as well as to meet some of the, what I would describe as onerous, particularly on the federal side, reporting requirements around the financial wherewithal as well. Building the capacity of groups to actually take on those functions, we believe is really essential, and it will give us a better sense of the true impact that we're actually having in communities that we serve as well. We have set up a number of what we call technical assistance and resource hubs. We have deployed our staff, financial staff, to help these entities build their particular backbone as well. And we have made available consultants to them to order to achieve those goals in addition. We believe a deeper partnership with the state would also be quite helpful in this particular work. I do want to underscore some of this work is going on. We think more needs to be done as well. And then finally, I always want to talk about, timing. We believe that many of the issues that we're facing, whether they're economic issues or issues around health disparities, are longer term commitments. And so a look towards more multi-year commitments for nonprofits is also essential. The instability associated with tackling some of the most difficult issues confronting our communities across the state of California, regardless of their social and economic status, we believe is best achieved through a much more stable funding process, with all the accountability that is required to ensure that we are being good stewards of public funds being in place, but allow folks to plan forward in ways that many nonprofits and our partnerships are reluctant or sometimes unable to do, simply because of the uncertainty about ongoing funding as well. So let me stop there. I said a number of things and take any questions you might have from this point forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hewitt. I will have to say that your presentation, we might just put that as a set of recommendations and issue the report tomorrow. Let me look to my fellow commissioners, and sometimes Commissioner Hernandez does have a question. Please.
Good to see you, Mr. Hewitt.
Good to see you. How you doing?
No, thank you for your presentation. As always, succinct to the point, and I agree. I mean, the recommendations are spot on. I mean, as you know, this commission, we're entrusted to make government a little more efficient, a little more easier to work, not only in the community, but with different entities. And I bet it's the proximity also to the Capitol that probably makes you a little more knowledgeable into some of the issues. But as we heard in the past, I mean, the previous speaker, in terms of having a central point of contact with the administration, I mean, can you expand a little bit of that in terms of your experience working with key individuals, whether legislature or agencies, and having a good understanding of how they work and how it facilitates a partnership?
Yeah. It is the counterpart to what I described in terms of having community groups that have good walkabout and trust in communities and who knock on doors and get answers. When you have somebody in the governor's office and the legislature who can actually walk you through those halls, makes those connections, introduce you to people who you may not know, that is incredibly valuable. Many of us are really focused on the day-to-day requirements of our job. And when we need those kind of external supports, we want to share some of our wisdom or receive some of it from folks. Knowing who to talk to and being able to get on their calendars is an essential part of what makes our work effective. I will say that on our community side, we have over 3,000 grantees across the state of California. And this year, we will move over $280 million into those communities. We are not a large foundation by our corporate size, but the greatness of the foundation is not its corpus. Its commitment to a set of issues and its ability to carry those things forward. So even the metrics we use about some of this work has been different. And I think that is just as true when I think about looking in the other direction into the public administrative or legislative branch. Relationships do matter still today, regardless of Zoom and all the technology we actually have. Getting in front of people where you can really have healthy debates about what may or may not work, what some of the limitations on funding or strategy may actually be, or even sharing some of the things that none of us would have thought about, and being, as I said, able to pivot quickly to address them. I use that insurance issue because who would have thought that one of the kind of impediments to paying folks who had actually already done work would simply be their insurance. And let me just be clear, paying people who didn't meet that threshold is not a good thing. Because under federal guidelines, it is an inappropriate payment that creates a disallowance, which means that that community group has to repay the money they've already spent. So it's not innocuous, it's not some sidebar. It is a really important thing to consider. And so the ability to talk with our colleagues in the governor's office about a fund, $1 million rapidly came together, pivoting to Cal Nonprofits Insurance Services, asking them about procuring that particular insurance, using their system of brokers to actually find it, and getting people eligible in a real time so they could be paid, shorten the duration for which they were actually holding invoices that were going unpaid was important. And let me just end by this, and I apologize for the long answer. That particular activity created a level of trust with nonprofits, both for the public sector as well as philanthropy, that 2 years after doing that, people still come up to me at conferences and offer thanks for our ability to have been part of that intervention. I hope I answered your question.
Definitely, thank you.
Thank you. We have, before I go to Commissioner Byer, as we think about this, commissioners and staff, the governor has a point person. These folks find that that's the mechanism to get there. Wouldn't it make sense if the pro tem and the speaker each had one as well? Anyway, Commissioner Byer.
Yes.
Yes, Commissioner Byer, you're muted, David.
Sorry, thank you for the testimony. I agree with the chairman. We can just bottle up your testimony and put it into a report. I want to focus a little bit on a theme that has developed over the last, frankly, decade on the Little Hoover Commission, which is state programs being effectively evaluated. And let me give you an example of an unrealized partnership that's possible. So the state of California in the next 5 years is going to spend $10 billion or more on mental health services with new money. One of the components is something that I'm sure you're familiar with, assertive community treatment or full service partnerships for people who have mental health problems and perhaps are unsheltered. 33 states have similar programs. They are all evaluated by universities. I'm going to use New York as an example. They have a ACT or full service partnership program. It's evaluated by Columbia University. In California, the University of California is the third largest hospital system, produces the most doctors, the most psychiatrists, psychologists, and nurses, yet they're not actively involved in evaluating how this state is spending its money for mental health services. Yet they're the ones who are going to be providing the future mental health workers. And they have tremendous outreach to patients in the outpatient context. Doesn't it make sense to put together a group of philanthropies, the University of California system, and the state so that the money that's been approved by voters is spent well on positive outcomes?
I could not agree with you more. We have tried to position evaluation as a learning enterprise, not let's see how we can ding you for things that did not go well. And clearly, as you state, the University of California system has tremendous research capabilities that need to be deployed. And I can think of a number of areas where they are working and where more work can be done. And clearly, this intersection between chronic homelessness, mental health, and well-being is one of those spaces where MHSA and the expansion of investments around mental health will actually take place. I'd also say that you describe that as a partnership, which isn't just simply a program of the university system, but is a program of a collaborative that has philanthropy and other plays in it. And I will just want to underscore, in agreement with all you said, how important that is, because the University of California, given that it is not only a trainer of physicians and folks who work within the healthcare field, but also a provider. But there has to always be some distance, some objectivity in how these programs are going to be rolled out as well. And so I'm not suggesting at all that they should not be involved. Actually, I am advocating that they would be involved. But I'm also saying broadening that partnership so that you create some of that objectivity within that evaluation, as well. It's okay for things not to go as well as you would have hoped, as long as you are as committed to making the improvements in real time as much as you possibly can. Implementation should never be the place that great policy goes to die.
Thank you.
Commissioner Aaroner.
I just want to add to that question from Commissioner Byer, just to say, including, there are other disciplines at the university that could also be involved. I'm particularly thinking of the schools of social welfare. That very often, and Chet knows about them, where they do significant analysis and data collection for us on a regular basis. So Chet, and it's good to see you again. I haven't seen you.
Yes, it is.
In this idea where you're talking about long-term commitment, one of my, I don't know what to do about this, except that, the state budget is a yearly thing, right? We don't do long-term budgets, right? The governor this time at least did a kind of did a 2-year budget, even though he'll have to come back to the legislature in January with his proposed 25-26 budget. But it's a problem in that it not only can administrations change their directions, right, and foundations change their directions, as we know often, but the legislature can do the same thing. But the one place that I can think of where the legislature and the governor and the administration can't do much changes is in entitlement programs, where they're continuously, the term is continuous appropriation.
That's right.
Right. And so the question is, and I don't know, I've never thought about this until just this moment, to be honest with you, because of the big problems that we're trying to solve with these kinds of partnerships, right, that don't go away. COVID is not going away. We all know that, right? Everybody got their newest vaccine last week or whatever, right? And there'll be another, something will happen again, right? Let alone what's going on with climate change. But how could we figure out a way to ensure that certain things can't be undone, right? Because our processes are very short term. We'd like the business community. The business community looks at whatever the next quarter is, right? Let alone long distance, right? Well, the government's kind of the same as well, because of the fact that we do such short term budgeting. Any ideas about that?
I think the notion of continuous appropriations, making that and moving that beyond some of the entitlement programs to some of the big issues. I'm not suggesting it should be used kind of willy-nilly about everything.
Yeah.
But let's use the pandemic. COVID pandemic was just around the scale and likelihood of disease spread. COVID is still around. It is endemic, not pandemic, and something that we need to deal with. So continuing appropriations around some of those programs, which can, as every state contract says, could be modified, depending on budget conditions, but creates the expectation that we're going to continue to go and have conversations around vaccinations, other things as a promotion of public health. The other thing I would say is let's be more creative in how we think about federal dollars. So it's not just all about the state budget. In California, we're about to receive hundreds of billions of dollars for infrastructure. Public health is infrastructure. And I think that we see that more now than ever before, given not only the pandemic, but even our ability to respond to climate-related crises, fires in the far north, and a kind of public health interventions to get people clean water and other things that promote health and well-being as well. So let's think about it in the way we think about infrastructure, in the way we think about roads and other things, which need continuing appropriations as well, and how we plan for the distribution of our federal dollars, which for infrastructure can be used over a 5-year period of time. That could have been a runway for helping to rebuild an architecture that when it was absent around the pandemic and COVID, we had to rebuild quickly, largely on the backs of nonprofit organizations who had the trust and walkabout in communities to deal with things around, like, how do you respond? Remember, stay away, cover your mouth, and so forth. And eventually the kind of vaccine hesitancy, particularly experienced by communities of color, with all the false information was out there, which made people reluctant to do the things that we know they needed to do in order to keep communities safe. I don't have a great answer for that because I think, Dion, and it really is great to see you again. It is a deep question and really worth exploration. But I will say the cost of the fits and starts and volatility in those systems means that we pay for that infrastructure multiple times over because there isn't any consistency to keep what we built, activated.
Thank you.
Good. Commissioner Sidley.
Thank you. And Mr. Hewitt, thank you so much for your testimony. You said something that suddenly I thought was very interesting to explore. I'm wondering from your experience, how much money do you think we leave on the table because we're not tapping into the federal programs, like the partnerships? Are we siloed? Like, I'll do a partnership with the state of California, but that's it. Or I'll do it with the federal government, but that's it. As opposed to possibly, what Governor Newsom has set up, that we now partner with both California and the feds. Or are those hurdles so extreme that we're not cross-pollinating, I guess? So I really love your perspective on that.
Yeah, great question. I think we're doing much better than we would have done, both in terms of accessing revenue and efficiently deploying it. Because you can throw a lot of money at things and not make a lot of progress, and you really want to combine those two things. And I think that they are a byproduct of doing exactly what you described, working bidirectionally, not just to the feds or to the state, but really taking a much more holistic approach to how we think about the resource space that we should be operating with as well. That kind of, crosswalking, boundary crossing, as the great Neil Pierce would say in his book, Boundary Crosses, is, I think, part of the kind of the concept or the architecture we have to bring to this particular work. Because I think we do two things by not doing it. I think we leave, and I don't have a good number on this, so I'm not going to try to give one, an enormous amount of resources on the table. And I think the flip side of that is those that we get are also probably not deployed as efficiently and with the same level of impact they might have otherwise have had as well. And that's why I try to attach this notion of infrastructure to public health, because it can't just be bridges and roads for people who sell steel and asphalt. Right? There has to be a way of actually creating this kind of multiplier effect. So the things that we will increasingly rely on, and I think this is an important part of this conversation, the things that we're seeing, the kind of disease burdens and natural disasters are coming. And we should now be thinking about the architecture to respond to those things, both from a financial standpoint, but also who delivers services to people when they're in crisis and need. And that is going to be, and has always been to a large degree, those who are closest to the problem experienced. You look in North Carolina around the hurricane, and who was first to show up? Neighbors and community organizations. Now, the help that comes from public entities is, essential. But on the front lines of these battles will be people in community.
Very good.
Thank you.
Let me take a survey of the commissioners. Any additional questions, comments? Seeing none, Mr. Hewitt, let me express our gratitude to you for taking the time to spend with us and to provide that information to help us along with our work. Much appreciated.
Thank you very much. Honored to be here. And again, any follow-up questions, please reach out. Be well.
Thank you, sir. So I think at this point, we're ready now for public comment.
That is correct, Mr. Chairman. We will move to public comment in the agenda. The public comment will be limited to 3 minutes per speaker, in keeping with the traditional practice of the commission. If you've joined the meeting via Zoom, use the raised hand function to indicate you wish to make public comment. If you have phoned in, please email us immediately at littlehoover@lhc.ca.gov. That address is on the screen now. Give us your phone number so we know who to unmute, but it's much preferable if you have joined via Zoom to use the raised hand function. I can see that there is no one in the public physical location who wishes to make public comments, so we'll turn to people who have raised hands. I believe, Shara, that we do have at least one hand raised, correct?
Yes, we do have a few hands raised. Our first public comment will come from Jennifer Fearing. You now have the ability to unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Chair Nava, Director Rarick, and members of the commission. I'm Jennifer Fearing, and it's just been so heartening to listen to this full conversation today. I've spent 25 years, so largely my whole career as a nonprofit employee, a CEO, and an advocate, including the last 10 years as Cal Nonprofits Sacramento advocate, and all of my advocacy clients here in the Capitol always have been and always will be nonprofits. So, and I also serve as a board member proudly of an environmental justice organization that serves communities in the Central Valley. So I share that preface just to share, that's part of why I appreciate all the energy and attention that you're bringing to this. And I'm cautiously optimistic that Little Hoover Commission's digging into this and hopefully issuing in a report will provide value to the legislature and the governor to keep making progress on these partnerships. I listened really closely to all the speakers today. They're excellent. I just had a few observations to share, and I'll lead maybe with a few cautions and clarifications that emerged from the conversations I heard. The first would be to be careful about conflating philanthropy and nonprofits. Philanthropy are nonprofits, but primarily within our sector, we look at philanthropy primarily as the investors and the funders side of the house, while other nonprofits are the service providers, right, in the grant seekers, those doing the work sort of on the ground. And I think depending on the context of your conversation and like how you're thinking about the partnership, just being mindful of the distinction there as you dig more into this, that nuance, I think, starts to matter more. Secondly, I heard mention of this, but it's important to mention from my perspective as well that it's really important to avoid where we can kind of top-down funder-initiated pursuits that are not fundamentally informed by the communities that they hope to support. You know, the CBOs on the ground that are built by and co-powered by the community know best what they need and know best what will work. And the more that we are all working to create processes and resources to empower them to do that work rather than kind of direct them too heavily about what they ought to be doing, I think is critical. And relatedly, sometimes I've seen over the last few years, it happened a lot during the pandemic as well, there can be an enthusiasm that wells up to create a new thing, to address what's perceived as a new problem. And we can throw a lot of money at a new thing that doesn't then create the lasting impact on the ground in the community because that did not build the capacity of the organizations that have been around and will be around. So I think even in the midst of crisis, the more we can look to the groups that are grounded in community and will stay there, there can be opportunities in crisis where more money comes to the fore to give to them. They will be able to utilize that in a way that lasts long further into the future. And while I think
Jennifer, your 3 minutes is wrapped up. If you can wrap up quickly, that would be great.
I apologize. I wasn't really tracking. There was a time limit. I'll
wrap up quickly.
Add that I think a senior advisor to the governor that also comes from partners with the nonprofit sector directly, the doers part of the house, would be really helpful as the senior advisor that's been philanthropy focused. And I'll just close by saying these contracting practices may feel kind of wonky, but they go right to the heart of outcomes and equity. And I'll encourage you to check out an October 1 Cal Matters article that was titled "Late Payments to Nonprofits Hamper California's Fight Against Homelessness," as sort of a perfect example of how these processes actually impair our ability to reach the folks we're trying to reach and solve the problems we want to solve. Thank you so much for taking this topic on.
Thank you. Our next comment will come from Krista Cullen. You now have the ability to unmute yourself.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you to the Commission for this incredibly important hearing. I want to give just such a huge +1 to everything that has been said by today's panelists and by Jennifer Fearing before me in public comment. The support for nonprofits, and in particular in the domestic violence field where I have the privilege of working, is essential from both the public and private spaces. Programs simply cannot do the vital work they do in communities without both. And these funding sources work hand in hand. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity to talk about how we can improve this. I will echo the value of advance payments and appreciate this commission for its work specific to the domestic violence field. And a huge gratitude for the focus on indirect costs and administrative costs. The expectations for grant management are extensive and seem to continually grow, but those costs so rarely are covered by the very grants that are requiring those items. Again, just to reemphasize the challenges with overly restrictive funding that limit the ability for nonprofits to be truly community responsive, nimble, and adapt to emerging needs. I'll also add just a few things that weren't touched on quite as heavily, but to echo that for this sector, like every sector, the need for funds that grow over time. Our staff deserve cost of living raises every year. Our costs to do business grow every year, and yet so often funding in this space does not. And this creates real pressure on nonprofits to consistently find new funders and raise new dollars just to sustain the very work they're doing, let alone to grow and do more. And again, I just want to really emphasize how important philanthropy is in the nonprofit sector. So often for us, it's the glue that holds things together and fills in the gaps that the government won't pay for through those restrictive government grants. And yet at the same time, the government funding is critical, especially when it comes to reaching communities where so often philanthropy is not funding or does not reach as far. And so again, just really grateful for this opportunity to continue the conversation about public-private collaborations, and the Partnership to End Domestic Violence is always here as a resource and support, and look forward to this continued conversation. Thank you.
Our next public comment will come from Rachel Mueller. You now have the ability to unmute yourself.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the conversation today and the opportunity to comment. Thank you, Chair Nava and Vice Chair Cannella and the commissioners. My name is Rachel Mueller. Today I'm speaking on behalf of Rural Community Assistance Corporation, RCAC, and Self-Help Enterprises, which are active members of the Nonprofit Equity Initiative and sponsors of the bill mentioned earlier, SB 336 by Senator Umberg, addressing indirect payment equity. RCAC is a 501c3 organization dedicated to working with underserved rural and indigenous communities to achieve their community visions and well-being. And Self-Help Enterprises addresses critical drinking water and affordable housing needs for low-income families and communities in the San Joaquin Valley. First, I want to thank the commissioners for the great feedback and questions today, and thank the panelists for sharing their expertise on these urgent issues affecting the strength and stability of all California's nonprofits. My comments today underline the need to reform how the state manages nonprofit contracts, particularly around payment practices and the treatment of indirect costs as mentioned today. The relationship between the state and its nonprofit partners should be one of mutual trust, collaboration, and respect. Nonprofits serve as the state's boots on the ground, delivering essential services in housing, healthcare, and community development. However, the current system doesn't reflect the spirit of that partnership. Advance pay and prompt pay, as previously discussed, ensures nonprofits have the funds upfront to serve their communities and are paid on time for the critical services they provide. As we've heard, many smaller community-based organizations just can't afford to wait for months to be reimbursed, which opens up service gaps in the very communities that need help the most. Just as important is the issue of equitable pay, particularly the fair reimbursement of indirect costs. Nonprofits are often forced to absorb these costs, which weakens their financial health. As noted earlier, at the federal level, the Office of Management Management and Budget recently increased the default indirect cost rate de minimis from 10% to 15%, recognizing that the previous rates were insufficient for nonprofits to cover basic operational expenses. Without swift action to address these issues, nonprofits may not be able to take on new initiatives or deepen their impact, which ultimately undermines the state's goals. As noted earlier, our efforts to address these issues in partnership with Cal Nonprofits and others were vetoed this year despite unanimous support from the legislature. If the federal government can adopt these changes to ensure nonprofits are fairly compensated, we know California should be able to mirror this approach. So I urge the commission to continue to champion this issue. Thank you so much for the conversation today. And this will ensure that California treats nonprofits as true partners, compensating them fairly so they can continue to deliver those essential services. And we will continue to work with the Nonprofit Equity Initiative and other partners and invite hopefully broader stakeholders to work with us to advance these reforms. Thank you so much for your time and consideration.
Mr. Chairman, I believe that is the last request we had for public comment, and we have no emails. So I believe we can close the public comment session. We've been meeting for a little more than 3 hours. So I will just briefly mention that the next meeting of the commission is 3 weeks from today on November 7th. That will be a business meeting. We'll issue the agenda, of course, later, but we anticipate bringing 2 reports to the commission seeking full commission approval. And we'll also be discussing, I believe, future topic selection. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I think we have completed the agenda.
Thank you. It was good seeing the commissioners again, even though it was through Zoom. Let me appreciate or express my appreciation to staff for the pivot that they had to make. This was scheduled to be an in-person meeting with all of the arrangements that were necessary with hotel rooms and travel. And so Shara and others then had to quickly figure out how to get us all on Zoom and then cancel our hotels and cancel our airplane flights. And so there's a whole lot of stuff that goes on that we're not necessarily privy to. But thank you to staff for handling that so efficiently and for running a tremendous meeting. And thank you to Crystal for the background memo that gave us the information to move forward on this meeting. So again, thank you to commissioners. It's a pleasure to see all of you, and we'll get together again next month. Bye, all.